Welcome to this morning's Police and Crime Committee meeting. My name is Sean Bailey. I am the chair. Our main item of business this morning will be the monthly question and answer session of the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. Can I please start by asking you to make sure that your electronic devices are switched off so we can avoid unnecessary interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies have been received.
I'll apologise for calling you Lorraine. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any interests to declare?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the Police and Crime Committee meeting held on the 26th of May 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee and additional correspondence sent and received?
Agreed. Noted.
We can now move on to our main item of business, the question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. I would like to welcome our guest, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. Good to see you, Sophie. How are you?
Thanks.
And Sir Steve House, who is on our video screen because he is remotely coming into the meeting. He is the Deputy Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police Service. Before we move on to the question and answer session, the Deputy Commissioner has agreed to provide an opening statement following the publication of the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel report last week. So please do go ahead, Deputy Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just check that members can hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Chair, last week the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel published their report following an 8-year inquiry. On behalf of the Metropolitan Police Service, I would like to join both the Commissioner and Assistant Commissioner Nick Fgrave in apologising to the family of Daniel Morgan for our failure to bring those responsible to justice. It's quite clear that our failings compounded the pain suffered by Daniel Morgan's family, and for this we profoundly apologise. As the Commissioner has said, we recognise that the family have shown incredible grit, determination and courage over the years since the terrible murder. I hope the report provides the family with some of the answers to questions that have arisen over the past 34 years. And I know from speaking to her yesterday that the Commissioner will shortly be writing directly to the Morgan family to set out the next steps that we as an organisation will be taking. The report is clearly significant and very detailed. We've been working at pace since Tuesday when it came out to consider its conclusions, last Tuesday when it came out, to consider its conclusions and recommendations, and that work is continuing. It's already clear that there is much in the report that we can and intend to learn from. There are also many areas where we have made significant progress since the murder of Daniel Morgan. I'm pleased to be able to update the committee today that the Commissioner has already appointed Deputy Assistant Commissioner Barbara Gray to lead our response to the panel's report. Barbara will provide regular reports to both myself and the Commissioner to ensure that all necessary actions and learning is appropriately undertaken. We also welcome the Home Secretary's announcement that the HMIC FRS will begin to work in this area as well. And as you would expect, we've already begun conversations with the Inspectorate to ensure their work can begin in earnest as soon as possible and that we cooperate fully with their inspection. As Assembly members will know very, very well from many of their involvement over the years, this case stretches over 4 decades. Since the murder of Daniel Morgan, the Metropolitan Police Service has continually tried to find justice for him and his family, and we will continue to do so. Members will remember that within a month of the murder, 6 men were arrested, 3 civilians and 3 police officers, Metropolitan Police officers, were arrested on suspicion of murder. Through 6 major investigations, other people have been arrested, but to date, no one has been successfully convicted of the crime. Thousands of lines of inquiry have been pursued, and there have been independent assessments and 5 forensic reviews. The most recent forensic review concluded in 2012. Can I be very clear that we accept and we deeply regret that corruption played a major part in the failure of the first investigation into Daniel Morgan's murder. It's quite clear that acts of individual police officers undermined the investigation. And as a senior police officer of 37 years service, I deeply, deeply regret that. It's a source of anger and sadness to all right-thinking police officers that this happened. The National Police Chiefs Council defines corruption as the improper exercise of power or privilege for the purpose of achieving a personal benefit or a benefit or detriment for another person. The Metropolitan Police Service does not accept that we are institutionally corrupt in this way. We don't accept that we don't have the necessary framework to identify and bring to book those who would abuse the privilege of wearing a police uniform. And we don't accept that corruption followed this case throughout the decades that we've been trying to find the offenders. Since Daniel's murder, we've completely overhauled our ability to root out corruption and ensure that every officer and member of staff understands their responsibility to the public to stand up for fundamental values of integrity, compassion, courage. But we are not complacent. The threat of corruption is constantly with us, and it is constantly evolving. It's a social evil. It's not limited to policing, and it remains an ever-present danger. We have the largest anti-corruption command in the country and have invested heavily over the past 30 years in a long-term and sustained and sustainable anti-corruption culture. I'm confident that we have never been better at finding corruption and getting rid of it. Now, the panel accuses the Metropolitan Police Service of being institutionally corrupt in the sense that we are alleged to have put the defence of our own reputation and image ahead of our duty to the public that we serve. I repeat that we do not accept that we are institutionally corrupt in this way. The current leadership of this organisation that I work with prides itself on our integrity and our courage. I simply would not, I'm speaking very personally here, I would not belong to an organisation that I thought was institutionally corrupt. I am proud of the officers that work in the Metropolitan Police Service and their dedication to public service. We are all very proud of the brave and dedicated professional officers and staff who work in this organisation. But what I do completely recognise is that occasionally pride can sometimes translate into over-defensiveness. We are probably the most scrutinised police service in the world. And we have to be mature and grown up enough to accept that that is a benefit of working in a democracy. Occasionally, we may be overly defensive. I accept that as an organisation, we could listen more. All organisations could. But we could do more to be open and transparent, to explain what we do and why we do it. And part of the function of yourselves is to make sure that we are held to account and recognise that is a vital part in gaining and retaining public confidence and trust. We will work with anyone to pursue our mission of becoming the most trusted police service in the world, and we are open to learning about how we could do that better. The panel also criticises over-provision of information to the inquiry itself. Any claim that we intentionally delayed or obstructed the panel's work is, in our view, not correct. In fact, we think we provided exceptional disclosure to the inquiry despite significant challenges. It was essential that extremely sensitive material was shared in a secure way that protected informants, witnesses, and covert techniques, many of which were deployed to try to find Daniel's killers. We went further with disclosure than ever before, and we took more risks than ever before in releasing information to the panel. The fact that an advanced security read was necessary before the report was released to the public shows the sensitivity of some of the material, and there was absolutely no advantage to the Metropolitan Police Service in being anything other than completely open. But I go back to my point about that we are sometimes overly defensive, and we will certainly read the report with great detail, and we will listen to anyone who wants to speak to us, and we will listen to the HMIC in terms of how we could interact more effectively with inquiry panels that are currently in place or those that are set up to deal with issues in the future. We are certainly very willing to learn in that area. You'll have heard that homicide investigators... Sorry, finally, I would like to just highlight there is still a possibility of solving this murder, however remote that may appear at the moment. Our work to make that happen will not stop, no matter how much time passes. You will have heard from various homicide investigators in other cases about how allegiances change and how people throughout the year change their attitudes. It's not unusual, and in fact has happened several times in the last few years, for people to come in and confess to homicides that took place decades previously. This is especially true in a case such as this. It is never too late for anyone to do the right thing. In addition, I can announce that we've also commissioned a new forensic review to look at a series of exhibits linked to this case. This is a process we conduct in all unsolved homicide periodically, and is something we have considered in this case for some time. We feel the conclusion of the panel report now marks the right time for this process to take place. You'll be well aware that in other cases, advances in DNA and forensic technology have led to new and compelling evidence coming to light, and it may be that that could happen in this case, and we certainly hope it will. We will always review any new evidence which comes to light and do all we can to bring those responsible for the murder to justice. I know that Assembly members past and present have scrutinised this case over many years, and I also know the committee will want to understand how the Met is going to take forward this report and its recommendations. For the avoidance of doubt, we are committed now to ensuring that the Police and Crime Committee is kept informed, and we'll be happy to answer any questions about our plans and progress, either at this meeting or at forthcoming meetings, where I'm sure it will be a subject of interest to you all. Chair, thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to read out the statement.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner. Members, can I ask the group leads have any questions they want to ask now? Just a short one, or do you want to wait until we have our session?
Chair, just very quickly, I think we should echo the Deputy Commissioner's announcement. Someone out there in the London community has information that's important to the police. If this case is still ongoing, then they should come forward. And Chair, you should issue a statement on behalf of this committee, maybe a joint statement with the Deputy Mayor calling for those people to come forward. There are people out there that know exactly what went on, and they need to speak to the police as a matter of urgency to give justice to the family. And I think we should try and do that if we can collectively agree that around this table.
Thank you for your comments, Assembly Member Duval. I will certainly issue a statement along those lines, I'm sure.
I just think we just need to seek clarification, because we will be holding future meetings at some stage on this issue. One of the questions to the Deputy Commissioner is, so the allegation against you of defensiveness and actions that relate to that in terms of leading to delays, so your argument is that should not count as part of systemic corruption, which I think is what the panel is taking into account. They're taking in the whole of the issues over the last 37 years, but in particular in terms of how you dealt with this inquiry. Are you saying, and are you acknowledging then, that sometimes that the Met, in terms of dealing with public inquiries or dealing with issues of where they are having to do that, can act in a manner that is too defensive, and in doing so, then causes some difficulty for the Metropolitan Police Service? Because it does seem to me, it goes to the heart of the matter about trust and confidence about how you carry on and learning the lessons from this inquiry. Can you just explain a little bit more in detail about that aspect?
Okay, thanks for the question. So I suppose what I'm trying to point out is that there are different definitions here of corruption. So the panel has got one definition which talks about the defensiveness and placing our own reputation above other things. That is not the National Police Chief Council's definition of corruption, which is, and nor is it the IOPC's definition of corruption. So that causes us a problem straight away, I think, in terms of clarity of communication on this issue. What I'm saying is that we refute very clearly any suggestion that in this case we did anything to delay or obstruct the work. And the Commissioner has been asked about that in public and has been very, very clear. She said, I didn't obstruct the work. I set out with my team, who were well-resourced, to ensure that we gave the panel maximum cooperation and that we did full disclosure as quickly as possible. I think it's important to point out that the panel had access to all the documentation in relation to the Daniel Morgan inquiry from 2015 onwards. And this is a huge inquiry with millions of documents, of pages of documents, with thousands of exhibits and interviews with suspects and witnesses and other people involved. So we do not believe, and the Commissioner has said very clearly, that we did not obstruct the panel. But what I have said is that if there are lessons to be learned going forward about how we can communicate better with panels, and it's important, I think, to point out that there are 24 recommendations from the panel, and a good number of those recommendations aren't addressed at the Metropolitan Police Service. They're addressed at the government in how they set up panels in the future, which I think is an acceptance that there is an issue here of clarity and on both sides, so that panels must be set up with the right composition and the right powers to effectively carry out their work. So I think there's a bigger issue, a bigger public governance issue here in terms of how panels are set up and how they are given their powers to investigate into whatever public body, whether it's police or others. But I'm absolutely clear, we do not accept that we obstructed this panel in any shape or form. In fact, I think we feel we went a very, very long way to meet all their needs as quickly as we possibly could. And I know this because I've spoken to members of the team who've worked on this for years to try to give the panel what they need.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Can I just, Caroline, Assembly Member Pigeon, and then...
Thank you. Deputy Commissioner, I listened carefully to what you've said this morning and also to what the Commissioner said on the day last Tuesday when the report came out. And you've apologised for a failure to bring anyone to justice. But I'm not sure I've heard, and maybe I just haven't quite caught it, an apology for the corruption that you have accepted took place at least in part of this. Have you apologised for the corruption?
Well, I thank you for the question. I absolutely believe that we have. But if anyone thinks that we haven't, then can I here and now apologise for the corruption? It's not that we're sorry for it. Frankly, I feel personally, I'm happy to say, I feel ashamed of the corruption that was involved. I don't want to be part, and no right-thinking police officer in this organisation wants to have any element of corruption inside this organisation, and it clearly played a part in the early parts of the investigation. That's obvious because in the first month of the investigation, we arrested 3 police officers in connection with the homicide. So from an early point on, within a month of the homicide, we knew that corruption was an issue and took action on that. That's a matter of deep regret, deep shame for the organisation. Of course it is. Any corrupt officer brings discredit and shame on the organisation. Everyone who carries a warrant card and our civilian staff who work alongside us is rightly ashamed when that sort of thing happens. But we have to be realistic and accept that it does. But in answer to your question directly, if that's not clear to the public or the media or indeed the Morgan family that we have. I'm very happy here to apologise for the corruption and that took part in the early stages of the homicide. It's clear it did, and it's clear that it shouldn't, and I'm very sorry that it did happen.
Thank you for the clarity.
Thank you. Assembly Member Devonish.
Deputy Commissioner, David Blunkett wrote a very good article in the Sunday Times on this very subject, and I'll just quote one sentence. He says the Commissioner needs to explain how she is preventing rather than coping with unacceptable behaviour and practice. Do you agree with that? And will you come back in your full response and address that point?
I read the article myself. I agree with some of it, but not all of it, as you might expect if you've read it. But absolutely agree with that. We are obliged to come back and explain to the public through yourselves and other bodies what we're doing to try to prevent corruption coming into the organisation, and where we identify it, to deal with it as effectively as we possibly can, either through the criminal courts or exiting those people from the organisation.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember David. Thank you, Commissioner, for those comments. We're now going to move on to our first question. It's actually addressed at you, Deputy Commissioner. Is the Met adequately resourced to police protests and demonstrations in London? Do officers have the right amount of protective equipment?
Thank you. In the vast majority of cases, the Metropolitan Police Service is perfectly able to deal with protests within London. And we see that on a daily basis in the capital. And we have done since the inception of the Metropolitan Police Service nearly 200 years ago. But I think the interesting point in your question is that not in all cases, of course, because we do occasionally rely on mutual aid from other police forces. And I would point, the most extensive that I'm ever aware of, probably apart from the policing of the Olympics, of course, which was an event, not a protest, but in terms of protests, would be the Extinction Rebellion protests that took place not so long ago, where we actually had mutual aid from virtually every other police force in the United Kingdom, including Police Scotland, because of the numbers of demonstrators were so high, and because the action we took. In fact, people will know we arrested several thousand protesters at those demonstrations. So we had to call on mutual aid. So there is a system across the United Kingdom where any force can call on other forces to come and assist them with either numbers of officers or specialist officers. For the Metropolitan Police Service, we are greatly imbalanced in that we are donators rather than recipients of that mutual aid. Usually, we often give mutual aid to other forces. So, for example, for the G7 that just finished recently in Cornwall, we contributed nearly 1,000 officers to the policing of that event. We will be doing something, no doubt, quite similar to the COP event in Glasgow later on this year. So we do occasionally call on mutual aid, but not very often. Do we have the right resources? We have the right numbers of officers, I believe, to deal with it. We have fantastic command team that is the most experienced in the United Kingdom in dealing with protest. And our equipment is regularly reviewed and we believe is fit for purpose. I'll leave it there, Chair, but happy to take more questions.
Thank you. But there were comments made earlier this year talking about Met Police not having the right equipment. And have you made steps to address that? I think,
Chair, if I may, I would interpret that as we have the right equipment. I think that the criticism was were officers wearing the right equipment. That's more of a tactical decision at the time for each operation. So the equipment is available. We have public order equipment for officers. So, for example, we have within the Metropolitan Police Service about 4,000 officers who are trained to what we call level 2 public order, and another nearly 650 trained to level 1, which is basically levels of training that they have so that they are more proficient in dealing with public order situations than the bulk of our officers. Each of those nearly 4,500 officers has their own personal issue protective equipment to deal with public order situations. So they have helmets, they have body protectors, and they're equipped with shields as well, if they need those shields. So they have the equipment. The question, I think, is more public order commander for each event will take a decision as to what state of equipment he or she wants the officers to be wearing at any particular time. And that will vary throughout the demonstration, depending on the nature of the demonstration and any perceived threat that the officers might be facing, either to other members of the public or to themselves. So we will sort of...
Let me give you a slightly different question then, because I take your point that the equipment is there and it's a decision if it's used or not. But what lessons have been learnt by the Met following debriefs after recent protests in London? Does the Met need to change its approach, including when it deploys equipment, when it doesn't, numbers? What is the main challenges there around that you're picking up from your debriefs and the changes that you plan to make, if any?
Thank you. So every operation has a debrief, and a significant part of that is were the tactics right, was the equipment right, were the decisions made at the right time, and with sufficient speed. There's always a balance to be found here, Chair, which is that for officer safety, if we have any information about violence, the obvious safest aspect here is to fully equip officers with full protective equipment from the start of any demonstration, which means that they would be that they would face demonstrators from the start wearing protective helmets with the flip down visors. They'd be wearing body armour, and they'd have shields, and they would have battens drawn. That's not an appropriate response to the vast majority of demonstrations, the vast majority of which are completely peaceful. But there is always the danger of some violence erupting because people feel strongly about the things they're demonstrating about. Otherwise, they wouldn't be demonstrating in the first place. So our commanders know that there's always a chance for an escalation of violence. The question is how quickly we respond to that escalation. That is often dependent on the intelligence that we have on the demonstration, what nature is going to be, the volume of people, the attitude of the people, whether there's likely to be violence, how extreme they may be, etc., etc. I think that is an area where we do face challenge in terms of gathering the intelligence. There's an issue of proportionality in terms of what tactics we can use to gather the intelligence. So often all we can do is rely on contacts with the organisers of the demonstration and anything that's available on open source social media, which talks about what the nature of the demonstration will be like. And also, we also obviously will assess it on if we know this group from the past and it was entirely peaceful in the past, is likely to be peaceful again going forward. And if it was violent, then clearly we would anticipate more violence. The intelligence gathering is a challenging area for us, and that was noted in the HMIC report, that it's very challenging to work out exactly what is going to happen ahead of time, because demonstrations have flashpoints. Different people come to demonstrations with different levels of feeling about it. Some are determined on violence from the start. The vast majority will simply want to be peaceful and go about the demonstration in a
sorry to interrupt
and hopefully lawful manner.
So we're deeply pressed for time, so I just want to quickly move you on to this then. Is the Met's approach to demonstrations in London consistent? Much of the grumbling has been around demonstrations being policed in very different ways. There's several examples. If you compare what happened with Extinction Rebellion to what happened with supposedly far-right groups coming out to defend statues as they saw it, is there a consistency there?
There is a consistency in the basic principles of how we will deal with a demonstration, which is if the demonstration is lawful, then we will deal with it in a certain way. If it is violent, then we will. If it's unlawful, we will deal with it in a different way. And if it is violently unlawful, we will go in a different direction. But I do have to say, every demonstration has its own challenge, its own character, and we don't therefore work to a pro forma, because to do that, I think, would mean that we would be disproportionate in how we deal with different demonstrations. So each one is judged on its own merits, on its own intelligence, and each commander will make an assessment ahead of the demonstration or the event as to how they will put together the tactics to deal with that. Flexibility is a key principle, that we can change our posture if necessary to try to protect the public and our officers as much as we possibly can. But we are consistent in our principles, which is that we will work with the organisers. We will try to maintain a peaceful demonstration, and we will try to maintain a lawful demonstration. If it becomes a violent situation, then we will escalate our tactics and we will escalate our protective equipment. Do we do that? Sometimes we can anticipate. We can't always anticipate. And sometimes, because there is violence offered to police officers, we suffer injuries to police officers, which is deeply regrettable, but I'm afraid sometimes is almost inevitable with some of the groups that we face. A policing operation against different groups demonstrating on different things will often look very different, because the groups are different, because the passion is different, the threat of violence is different. So it may not look consistent to the public. There are consistent principles, but each one has to be judged on its own circumstances.
Thank you. Can I just at this point bring in Assemblymember Devonish and then Deval? Go.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Commissioner, I'm not quite sure that you answered A.M. Bailey's last question, so I'm going to ask it slightly differently. Why is there a perception that you do not police demonstrations in London in a consistent basis?
Well, I'm sorry if I didn't answer the question. I certainly tried to. Why is there a perception? It's difficult for me to say why there's a perception, to be honest. That may be because people perceive it differently, and I don't know why they would do that, or the media may report it differently. And again, I can't comment on why the media might be doing that. People will form their own opinions on what they see. We're often accused by certain parts of the media as not doing anything about Extinction Rebellion and tolerating Extinction Rebellion. We arrested, I think, 4,000 people over the two big XR demonstrations. So that, to me, that's doing quite a lot. It's the biggest number of arrests we've ever made in a public order situation. So the media and the public will have their own perceptions based on their own views of what we do and how we react. All I can say is that we have consistent principles about how we go about policing public order, but we expect our public order commanders, who I again would say are the best in the world, frankly, in terms of policing, we expect them to design a bespoke plan for each of the demonstrations that we face.
Deputy Commissioner, I was talking about the public rather than the media. I'm not as concerned about the media as some people are. Let me give you another analogy I was given by a senior resident very recently. He said that the way the Met, and he lives on the path of all these demonstrations, from XR and Black Lives Matter through to the Palestinian demonstrations recently, and he put it very well when he said the Met are a bit like changing the gears on a car. Sometimes they do it quite well, but sometimes, regrettably, it almost takes quite a long time between going from first gear to second gear to third gear to fourth. And a good example of that is XR, where you did arrest a lot of people, but you took an awful long time before you started doing it. And then the recent Palestinian demonstrations, where what my residents were particularly disgusted about was not the fact they had the right to demonstrate, but they were wandering around back streets all over London with hate-filled banners. And you got your act together on the second day to some extent, and the second weekend far more, but it's often the first day of the demonstration where there's no consistency, because I guess you are learning on the path. I wonder how you can comment on that, because it's your initial response and the consistency in your initial response to a demonstration in the first few hours that I'm always quite concerned about.
Okay, it's a very good question, but again, I would say that we design our public order response to be bespoke to each of the demonstrations that we deal with. If we have dealt with demonstrations before and they've been violent before, then we will obviously be, to use your analogy, in the right gear and fairly geared up for that demonstration being violent. And if it's not, then that's a pleasant development. If we're dealing with demonstrations of groups that we've never dealt with before, using tactics we've never dealt with before, then quite clearly we live in a democracy. There, as you identified, that there is a right to protest so long as you do that lawfully, and therefore, if a demonstration commences lawfully, and the vast majority both commence and finish lawfully, but most demonstrations start off lawful and peaceful. And therefore, our policing response to that is one that is appropriate and responsive to that, proportionate to that. If the demonstration then becomes unlawful and then proceeds to be violent, then the police will react to that. But we are by necessity reacting rather than being proactive, simply because there is a right to demonstrate guaranteed by legislation. And the most efficient police service would if you were simply interested in having no demonstrations, then you could deal with that. But that's not our stance, as you well know. Therefore, we are often reacting to how a demonstration will develop. I think that frankly is simply the way things will have to be, because we are reactive rather than proactive in relation to many of the demonstrations. We have to wait to see how they develop.
Okay, Deputy Commissioner, I must say I'm not particularly happy with that answer. Deputy Mayor, I guess the two main, and I'll be very brief here, two main examples recently. One was perhaps more of an amusing example, a boat left in Piccadilly Circus. I wasn't particularly happy with that there for weeks, but the one that really concerns me I'll come back to was the hate-filled banners last month for the Palestinian demonstrators. Not just one or two, but literally hundreds of people wandering around my constituency with hate-filled banners, and I didn't see the police deal with any of them, and I was watching for hours. Have you got any comment on that, Deputy Mayor?
In terms of the examples that you give, clearly these are operational decisions for individual police officers on the streets as to whether banners that are being carried constitute a hate crime or constitute, trying to provoke a hate crime. And those are operational decisions of the Metropolitan Police. In terms of what the Deputy Commissioner has said, I think we have got the best public order policing probably in the world. There are very difficult decisions that are taken not just day to day, minute to minute, as to what is an appropriate level of enforcement or an appropriate interaction or engagement with the protesters. And I think the Metropolitan Police do extremely well in very difficult circumstances on many occasions in London. Can I just say, one of the things I think, just going back to your first question, Chair, around does the Met have the appropriate resources around policing individual protests? And obviously the Deputy Commissioner has been very clear for individual protests on the vast majority of occasions, yes, they do, and occasionally they have to get mutual aid. But I think one of the things you as a committee may be interested in looking at is what is the overall burden on the Metropolitan Police of the number of protests that, rightly, I'm not at all suggesting that they shouldn't be protests in the capital city. People have a lot to protest about, and there's very strong feelings. But that burden on the force as a whole, strategically, financially, but also that burden on individual officers, because Deputy Commissioner talks about the level 2 trained officers. They're not, they've got fantastic training, but they go back to their day jobs. They're policing in the boroughs, they're doing neighbourhood policing, they're working long shifts, and there is a real burden. If you talk to the senior leadership of the Met at the moment, one of the worries and the risks one of the concerns they have at the moment is, of course, the policing of London, but also the fatigue of officers. And we've really got to make sure that the Met has the resources and the officers it needs, not just to police the crime and the neighbourhoods of London, but actually as a capital city to be able to police the protests.
Just to go back to this question of banners, do you think there's a role for the mayor to be more vociferous in letting people know if they're going to protest in London, they need to protest within the law, and these banners in particular, he could say something on?
As I've said, the individual circumstances of individual banners are operational matters for individual officers on the streets and for the public order command. I think the mayor and myself and the Metropolitan Police have been very, very vociferous, very, very clear that there is no place in London, on the streets of London, on any banners for hate, for trying to provoke hate. There is absolutely no place, and the Met do take a zero tolerance approach to that. I don't think the mayor could be clearer about that. And in fact, not only is he very clear about what, that zero tolerance approach to hate, he's been investing in projects and programmes to really try to make sure that people understand, you've got that cohesion, that in London we are tackling where hate is bubbling, and we are making sure that there are projects and programmes to do that. So the mayor's really clear about communicating that there's no place for hate in London, but also making sure that there are projects and programmes that are trying to prevent that hate from developing.
Chair, I had one final question, if you wouldn't mind. For the Deputy Commissioner, there wasn't that many arrests after the Palestinian events, but we're often told that arrests follow afterwards. Will you be able to write to us with the level of arrests over the last 2 weekends of last month, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblyman Deval?
Thank you very much. My questions concern resources to the Metropolitan Police Service as well as powers. So let's deal with the resources one first. In relation to policing of demonstrations, there is a cost to it. That's not an argument not to allow peaceful protests to be undertaken. But the Met's underfunding through the national and international capital cities grant, despite the independent panel's review to government saying it should be paid in full, what would that be? What would be the implications of that? Will we have more officers for demonstrations, but also more officers to do other policing if that was paid in full? How would that money be used? If you got it.
Is that a question for myself?
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, yes. So, I mean, firstly, I agree with your comments, and that we are still pushing the government to fully fund the NIC funding. It covers a range of issues, organised crime, and the fact that as a capital city and a global city, we do attract a great deal of demonstrations and public order events. An example being the one that's just been mentioned, which is tension in the Middle East leads to demonstrations and policing needs on the streets. So we would anticipate that if we were fully funded for NIC, which is many tens of millions of pounds extra funding, then we would be able to increase the number of officers. We would be able to increase officers within in our serious crime commands to deal with organised crime, which also affects us because we're a global capital city, but also the public order element as well. Members may not be aware, but our number one response to public order policing, most highly trained officers are territorial support group officers. The territorial support group has been reduced in numbers in the last 10, 15 years. As the Met numbers were cut, the TSG numbers were cut proportionately as well, and they are lower than they used to be, which does mean that we have less highly trained officers to deal with public order than we used to have. I still say that we are adequately resourced for it, but we could always use more resource. More resource would mean that we would be able to provide specialist officers policing more of these events, and we would be able to deal, I think, more effectively with some of the more violent situations had we more resources. I think that stands to reason, really. I would just say that it would also relieve the burden that the Deputy Mayor talked about in terms of the drain on officers. So just for members' knowledge, in terms of in the financial year 1920, officers in the Met spent 137,000 tours of duty on demonstrations. That's 137,000 tours of duty which could have been spent in local policing. So the abstraction from local policing is significant, because with the exception of the territorial support group, there's only about 450 of the officers. The vast bulk of our public order trained officers are working on response teams and on safer neighbourhood teams and are abstracted for that purpose. So extra money would mean that abstraction would be lessened.
And then if we can turn to the powers, the new powers, I think we discussed it here at the Assembly post the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations of the need to overhaul policing powers in relation to demonstrations. It's quite controversial, some of those aspects. I was a bit shocked on reading in detail about that's going through the police crime sentencings and court bill. So what's the extra work and training that will be undertaken if it goes through the House unamended to ensure officers are applying it to new powers properly and appropriately? And as the Chair said earlier on, the consistency of knowing what's going to happen. If you're a peaceful demonstration, it will be all right. If it becomes unlawful, is something going to happen or not going to happen around that? What's the thinking from the Met around these new powers?
So some of the powers in the bill that's going through Parliament and itself ironically causing demonstrations of public order situations is the thing that we have asked for. In the main, we asked for clarity around certain sections that already exist in the public order legislation, just effectively to equalise our ability to put conditions on various marches and demonstrations. So the training that would take place would simply be, we would factor it into our level one officers, who are the vast bulk of the Metropolitan Police Service, would get some basic training in it so that they're aware of changes in public order legislation. Our more more highly trained officers who are deployed on public order situations would get more training so that they were aware of what the legislation requires. The ones that we've asked for, the equalisation in terms of the ability to put conditions on, is more for the...
I think we're experiencing technical difficulties. Hopefully the Deputy Commissioner comes back to us.
Maybe the Deputy Mayor could help us if there's any knowledge around the preparations for that. Obviously, some of the issues and the applications of the new powers in relation to noise, there is, demonstrations are allowed by their nature. What's your understanding about how the Met's going to apply those judgment calls that I think the Deputy Commissioner mentioned earlier on? Every demonstration is different, but how will they apply that? Has there been any conversation with your office about some of that thinking?
Haven't had any discussions around how, if all the clauses in the bill at the moment do become law, and actually don't expect them to become law for quite a long time because it's such a mammoth bill and it is controversial. We haven't had any conversations about how they operationalise them. I think what the Deputy Commissioner is probably going to come on to about training was that some of the things that they have asked for are for their more senior leadership and those that are in charge to take decisions around conditions. So it may not be a question of widespread training, but I haven't had discussions about that because it seems a long way in the distance at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Russell, were your questions for the Deputy Commissioner?
They were. It was about the policing of the demonstration at the Science Museum at the weekend.
We are attempting to reconnect with the Deputy Commissioner.
Shall I go on and ask the Deputy Mayor my question?
Yes, we should, and we'll circle back.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor, how do you monitor the Met's conduct at demonstrations and hold them to account?
In terms of oversight of the Met, we have regular discussions in terms of planning activity looking forward as to what the operational response is going to be of the Met, and that's just oversight. That clearly isn't intervention, because as I've said, these are operational policing decisions. And then after major protests, we will have, as the Deputy Commissioner talked about, they have their debrief, and if there are lessons to be learned around that, we will have discussions around it. We also have operational oversight and in terms of officers in MOPAC who are engaging with the Met as well at different levels to enact that oversight.
Okay, I mean, my colleague, Assemblymember Devonish, mentioned perception, and as a politician, you'll understand perception is very important. And so when you look at a demonstration and see things like the footage which emerged of a mob walking through the streets of central London yelling, "We'll find some Jews, we want the Zionists, we want their blood." Well, at least one police officer was seen walking alongside that group. Did you inquire as to why arrests weren't made?
Of course, as part of oversight, when those types of incidents come to my attention, of course I do ask for, in terms of what happened there. Then on that particular occasion, that is being reviewed, and I haven't had any response back yet from the Met, but I, of course, have those discussions with the Commissioner or with the Deputy Commissioner as to what has happened here. How do you assure the public, and how do you particularly assure the Jewish community that your officers are taking any anti-Semitic or hate crime and hate incidents really seriously? I do have those discussions to make sure there is that oversight good. And to understand that. And there have been a number of instances, where those types of things have come to light, and then the police have made arrests. For example, the car that was in Finchley, blaring out really just dreadful, not just anti-Semitic but misogynist statements. The Metropolitan Police followed that up because of it coming to their attention and have made arrests.
But do you not understand that the perception of the Met, which we're all concerned about, is not helped when you see police officers on their knees, when they see them openly supporting Palestine? There's been some other events, and as I say, a police officer walking alongside when a group are making these hateful comments towards the Jewish community. Do you not think that the perception of the Met is damaged quite considerably because they're not seen at the time to be making any arrests or, in some instances, siding with one party or another?
I think there's a really important question here, isn't there, in terms of when videos do go viral, of course they can damage the reputation of the Met, and they can damage the confidence of some communities in the Metropolitan Police's ability to protect them. However, often those videos don't show the whole picture, and when they are reviewed, either there's action that's taken afterwards, but does that land in the same way as the social media, that viral clip? Often it doesn't. That's a real difficulty. I accept that. That is a difficulty in perception, but it doesn't mean that the Metropolitan Police aren't taking the action where they can, that they should be taking. And of course there is a question about reassurance to particularly the Jewish community when we're talking about these incidents. And I know that the Metropolitan Police are interacting and engaging with the Jewish community locally across London, across the boroughs, as am I, as are other parts of City Hall, to give them that assurance that the Metropolitan Police are absolutely taking a zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitism and hate.
Well, I can say to you, if there are more demonstrations of this kind, and police officers stand by and are not seen to be doing something when this terrible abuse is going on, the perception will continue to get worse of the Met Police, and there isn't one person on this committee that would be happy about that. So I would respectfully suggest something actually starts to happen about this. It can't go on as it is. I have other questions for the Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, but
if I might say, I don't think something must start to happen. As with every time there's the Metropolitan Police, as does City Hall, we monitor what's going on in communities and the tensions that are going on in communities. There is proactive work taken at neighbourhood level and local level to engage with synagogues, with mosques, with community
we all
leaders
know all of
to
that.
reassure. So it's not a question of the Met needs to start to do something. There is really, really serious work being undertaken to give assurance to communities that feel vulnerable.
I will change my wording. They must be seen to be doing something, and that's the difference there, isn't it? Do you agree with the findings from the recent HMIC FRS is their inspection of how effectively the police deal with protests?
There was the thematic review from HMIC FRS around policing a protest across the country, which talked about the balance, didn't it? About was the balance right between the policing of the protest and the ability to allow, of course, the freedom of speech and the ability to allow marches and assemblies, and then what impact that has on the community. I think what the Chief Inspector, Matt Parr, who was the inspector who wrote the report, said about that was a question is the balance right? There may be a need for a small amount of tweaking around that. I think in terms of London, the Met, in the vast majority of cases, gets that balance absolutely right in terms of engaging and ensuring that people have the right to protest and a right to voice their opinions, whilst also, and of course there will be disruption, trying to ensure that disruption is minimal.
Well, I was particularly mentioning that it found that when police forces do not accurately assess the level of disruption caused or likely to be caused by a protest, the balance may tip too readily in favour of protesters. Do you agree with that?
I think, the HMIC report, that can happen. I think in the vast majority of cases in London, which is clearly my area of oversight, that the Metropolitan Police takes the operational decisions that really does try to balance the right of people to protest and also the right of Londoners and visitors and businesses to carry on their everyday work. We are the capital city and there is disruption. As we will all have had on many occasions, had our journeys disrupted because of protests. Vast majority of cases, the Met gets that right. And as the Deputy Commissioner says, they debrief, they learn the lessons, and they put that into the way that they make those judgment calls going forward.
Okay, having journeys disrupted is one thing. Having
Business,
a whole community,
absolutely.
the Jewish community, have this sort of abuse shrieked at them is quite a separate one, and I think we're all concerned about that. I'll leave it there, Chair, because the other
Thank you very
questions
much. Before I go to Assemblymember Russell, just a bit of a clarification. When Assemblymember Hall asked about demonstrations and how they're policed, you used the word "if they come to your if you're made aware of something, you will follow it up. Is there no routine debrief between your office and the Met when it comes to major demonstrations in London?
I have regular bilaterals with the Metropolitan Police, and as I said, I have routine forward looks as to what is happening in terms of the intelligence around protests. I chair a meeting once a week around that, where we look at that, and then afterwards we will have, at the bilaterals we will have a debrief if there are lessons to be learnt. But if things have gone off, the protests have happened and there has been no lessons learnt and there's been no issues, it's not going to be one that we will discuss.
I understand, because we have huge protests and
have
tiny
massive
ones.
amounts of protests.
But is there a mechanism to trigger, or does somebody say, okay, this is at a level that we do need to have a debrief?
My regular bilaterals have always have a regular, a standing item of operational matters. If there are issues around protests in London, they'll be raised during the operational matters.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Russell.
Yes, well,
The Commissioner is back, by the way. The Commissioner is there.
Oh, the Deputy Commissioner is back.
Yes, once you ask the question, he speaks, he'll appear.
Excellent. I imagined we were still without him. So yes, it's about the protest at the Science Museum on Saturday evening, and 30 officers turned up to a peaceful protest of about 20 young people and scientists. And what the protesters have told me is that they tried to liaise with the detective inspector, but they were told that he had no hesitation in arresting them and they would never get jobs in the future or be able to travel. The protesters felt intimidated by this, so my question is it appropriate to threaten young people who are protesting peacefully like that at the outset of an engagement?
Question for the Deputy Commissioner.
Yes.
So thank you. Can I apologise to members? I've no idea what happened with the technology there. It just suddenly died mid-sentence on me. I'm sorry about that. In terms of that question, you're obviously talking about a specific operational incident. I don't have the details of what the inspector is supposed to have said to the people who were there. I can look into it, and frankly, I think that would be best to look into it and write to you. I have no doubt that the demonstrators might have one view, and I have no doubt that the inspector might have another, which is to say to them, look, if you get, you may be engaged in a peaceful demonstration. Because it's peaceful, it doesn't mean it's lawful. And this is something I think the public needs to understand, and we all need to understand. Something can be entirely peaceful and entirely unlawful. And the vast majority of the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations that took place were peaceful, but they were unlawful, in our view. So if an inspector turns up and sees people demonstrating and believes it's unlawful, he may have a conversation with them to say, look, you're breaking the law right now, and you are subject potentially to arrest. Are you aware of what would happen if you are arrested and found guilty? And I can only assume that was what the conversation was, but I can certainly look into it and write to you. I think that would be better than speculating.
I think that would be appreciated. I have seen film footage of it and it does seem intimidating, but yes, it would be great if you could look into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Russell. Before we move on to our next session, a question for the Deputy Commissioner. What does the Met do to ensure that officers remain independent and impartial while policing demonstrations? This taking of the knee, there was an officer who at the Palestinian demonstration was clearly on one side and made that quite clear to the public. Many members of the Jewish community very distressed by that, and the wider public just quite surprised that a police officer felt he could join in. Is there anything that you do to mitigate these situations?
There is. Thank you for the question. And in reference to that specific incident where the officer gave what looks like very clear support to one side of a demonstration, that's entirely inappropriate. And I and a number of other senior officers were blizzarded with comments from serving operational officers saying how unhelpful that was and how difficult it makes their job. And I understand the distress it caused the Jewish community. I was in contact around those times of the Palestinian demonstrations with the Jewish community, both through video calls and correspondence and phone calls through the Community Safety Trust. I accept that that's a difficult thing to see. It was difficult for police officers to see as well, that they were doing that. In relation to taking the knee, that took place at very early stages in relation to Black Lives Matter. We can see how controversial that is, and that we still see controversy around sportsmen and women taking the knee at sporting events. But it's been made very clear to officers immediately after that happened that in the public order situation and an operational situation, taking the knee is completely inappropriate and not to be done. And that is reinforced in general at any relevant public order briefing that takes place. At every public order briefing that takes place for officers, they are reminded of the values of the Metropolitan Police Service, they are reminded of the Human Rights Act, and they are reminded that they must act impartially throughout the demonstration and not show favour in favour of the demonstration, and just they are there to police, not to show any sort of support for anything. That's made very clear. We reinforced that message following the unfortunate event at the Palestinian demonstration to make sure that officers were aware of it. But it is something that officers are made aware of from day one of their training. You know, the oath that officers take makes it very clear that they are to be impartial in these sort of issues, and that they are there to uphold the Queen's peace. They are not there to make political statements. And that's reinforced throughout all training that police officers undertake. And the deep concern that I felt from officers inside this organisation and from other police forces when that video clip was shown of the officers supporting underlines the fact that the vast majority of officers understand that and prize it as part of the basic DNA of British policing.
Thank you, Commissioner. Assembly Member, please.
Yeah, just a very quick question. Protests, events, policing of these large matters. The HMI report that came out on the Clapham Sarah Everard vigil really criticised the Met in terms of absence of effective communication to the Silver Commander, not knowing what was going on the ground, and also there were criticisms that the Council Gold Commander couldn't get through to the Met Police Gold Commander. In your review of that, have you put in place proper communication systems and made some improvements for future such events?
We pay attention to every recommendation that comes to us. The HMI report, as you well know, was extremely supportive in the main of the actions that the Metropolitan Police took and the actions of the officers on the night, and indeed went out of this way to praise the behaviour of the officers on the evening. But there were comments about communication issues that could be improved, and we've certainly taken those on board.
Lovely, thank you.
Assembly Member Ahmed.
Chair, to both panel members, in response to concerns from women that have become more heightened recently, what proactive action has the Met and MOPAC taken to ensure that women and girls feel safe?
Let me start with the Deputy Mayor, because...
Okay, this is not in relation to protests. We've moved on to...
Would you like a repeat of the question?
No, that's fine.
It's about violence against women and girls. Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, in terms of, we know that many women and girls in London don't feel safe, and that is a real matter of concern, not just to me, but to the Mayor and senior leadership of the Met. In terms of proactive work that we are undertaking, we're working very closely with the Met, and I'm sure Deputy Commissioner will come on to some of the, like the walk with female officers that is happening in the local area around Clapham. But actually, we are working with the Met. One of the things that I point to is there's been a real step change, and I really welcome this in terms of a focus on violence against women and girls. So, for example, the operational plans of Metropolitan Police for tackling violence this summer. Absolutely, there's a focus on street violence and knife crime, but there's also a focus on violence against women and girls. I went out with the Violent Crime Task Force in Wood Green about a week and a half ago. The briefing before that, before they went out onto the streets, had the briefing around street crime and street violence, but it also had a briefing around public space, violence against women and girls. I think that's really important in terms of reassurance to women and girls in London that the Met are absolutely focusing on that violence, on reassurance, and on how women and girls in London don't don't always feel safe on the streets and in public spaces. And there is a campaign and a real message going out to women and girls that if you are being harassed on the streets of London, as the Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe has said, and the communications are, you need to report it, you need to make sure that the Met are aware of it, because unless it is reported, unless the Met are aware of it, they can't take action.
Deputy Commissioner?
It's on mute now.
Sir.
Sorry, I'm just conscious of background noise, apologise. Yeah, I would emphasise what the Deputy Mayor has said, that the events of the summer and the tragic, horrific murder of Sarah Everard have brought this into sharper focus for the Metropolitan Police Service. I would say we are developing a specific strategy for violence against women and girls, which will be launched in July. But despite that and before that, we have put much greater emphasis for our officers, so particularly our dedicated officers in terms of Violent Crime Task Force and our other units that focus on it, particularly in public spaces, to pay more attention to the safety and well-being of women and girls in public space. We've increased patrols in public space areas. We've rebriefed our officers in terms of women, particularly in the evening, journeying home, to make sure that they are as safe as they can be in London. The mission of the strategy is to increase confidence amongst women and girls about our response to violence against them, and for women and girls to feel safe and safer in London. It's focusing on 3 specific areas: to increase the safety and their perception of safety by increasing patrols in public spaces, and to work with women and women's groups to talk about where they particularly feel vulnerable and make sure that we're reinforcing our presence in those areas, to work with others to provide greater intolerance of violence against women and girls, and to work with partners in the criminal justice system to manage offenders and improve the outcome for victims, which takes you into the criminal justice system and its performance in relation to various offences against women and girls, particularly rape and sexual offences, which is also part of the strategy. We've listened very carefully to the many thousands of women within our own organisation, to their concerns, which has helped us understand their concerns about safety as they go about London, and also helped us see the problem through a lens which we perhaps weren't sufficiently focused on before, but we certainly are now through the events of the summer, and it's a very clear focus for the organisation going forward. Our Violent Crime Task Force, our Violence Suppression Units, and all the officers on response teams are focused on trying to make sure that women and girls have greater confidence in public spaces in London in the future.
Thank you both. Deputy Commissioner House, a question for you. Both the Deputy Mayor and you...
I can't.
Speak up, member. The mics are not the most effective.
Sorry, I'm not tall enough to...
Definitely a man's desk.
Yes, it definitely is designed
Well, a
by
tall
men.
man's desk, maybe.
Can you hear me now, Deputy Commissioner?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah,
Thank
I can.
you. I can shout, as my children know. So for you directly, what, and the Deputy Mayor and yourself, you've alluded to this. What has the Met learned from its pilot scheme taking place in Lambeth and Southwark, where local women are joining police officers on patrol to share their concerns about safety, and what, as a result, will you do differently? And also, what are the timescales for this pilot, and how will its effectiveness be monitored and measured?
Thank you. Good question. So, as you know, the pilot's underway at the moment. We've got 25 women officers are teaming up with women from the community to walk the streets of South London and listen to the experiences and the concerns and their reflections. So the aim of it is to start a conversation with women so that we get a better understanding of the concerns, so that we can actually design our response better. But last month, we had an intense day of action cracking down on violence against women, and we saw 117 people arrested and a series of reactive arrests for domestic abuse, sexual offences and various other violence offences against women. The sergeant who came up with the idea and who's running it, Becky Perkins, has been quoted in the press quite extensively on this. I think I would say at the moment we're still at the learning stage. So I haven't seen the closing report yet, but we will, I hope, shortly in relation to the pilot. And I'm happy then to write to you and give you the details, or indeed come back to the committee and talk about it then.
And thank you, but could you just answer the question about monitoring and how that's going to take place, please?
Well, we're waiting for the pilot to finish. We'll then get a readout from the pilot itself to see what are the lessons learned, and we will then work to implement those lessons learned across London. At the moment, as you know, it's in a fairly tight geographic area. We'll want to widen across the whole of the capital.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Can I just chip in here? Deputy Mayor, what would your expectations be around monitoring this scheme and some indicators of its performance? What would you be looking for?
Looking for to understand what's changed in terms of what has been fed back to those officers that are going out on the patrols with members of the public, what's been changed, and looking for some concrete examples of that. But obviously, we seem to be talking about particularly around how women feel safe in public spaces. So you would want to be able to monitor that perception of women through through surveys and through a public attitude survey, for example. That was what I would be looking for. Whether you'll be able to see that in a short pilot or not is a question. And whether you'll be able to isolate that pilot. I mean, this is all quite academic, isn't it? Isolate that particular pilot for any shifts in how women feel, because it's not just that pilot that's taking place, is it? In terms of how the Met is working and what we're doing from City Hall, there is a lot of very good work to try to reassure women about their safety, but also to try to improve their safety. So, for example, I work very closely with Amy LeMay, the Night Czar, on rolling out the Women's Night Safety Charter. Really important charter. Over 500 businesses already signed up. We're wanting more to sign up to that. And it's not just signing up to the charter. It's about training businesses and training venues about how they can ensure that women feel safe and that they are safe.
Isn't that the challenge? We have all these different schemes, we're spending all of this money, we don't know which is good, which is bad, because there's such a mishmash of things. Surely we need to find a way of measuring these things. One of the criticisms levelled at much of the Mayor's activity in the past and with his current manifesto is sweet words, absolutely no KPIs, which is a real problem, because we then don't know what has worked, and then, should we increase it or should we spend the money elsewhere? So surely your office needs to look at everything it's doing in partnership with the Met and design some kind of way of measuring the effectiveness of a scheme, or isn't it a waste of money?
I totally agree with you. There needs to be a way to measure effectiveness of schemes, and on all the projects and programmes that we invest in, have KPIs, have careful monitoring of the contracts and have careful monitoring of the impacts. What I'm saying is that sometimes it's complex, isn't it? As anybody who's provided any programmes, will be able to say is you can see an impact, but can you absolutely isolate the impact of all schemes? Sometimes that's not possible, but you can certainly see impacts, and everything we invest in is very carefully monitored. There is a sliding scale of evaluation depending on the amount of money that's invested, from really in-depth academic evaluation, like we are, Child House, for example. Really in-depth academic evaluation of Child House is taking place. But for smaller grants, we'll have some, outcome measures and some KPIs in that contract or that grant to make sure that what we've invested in has been delivered.
I take your point. If you spend a small amount of money, you can't then ask those people to do vast evaluations. But surely your team needs to have a better idea of the tapestry, because all of these small grants do amount up to a serious amount in the end. And if we're not just going to give money out the door, surely your team needs to look at where this small grant is and it's their collective effect. And if you're going to fund something, surely that could be done in here.
Absolutely, and I don't think we're disagreeing, and I don't think you are pointing out a gap in what we do. We do have that understanding, we do have that overview, and we're very happy for you to have a briefing in terms of how we evaluate from our evidence and insight team, as well as our contract management, how we evaluate the impact as well as the value for money for the contracts and grants that we give out from MOPAC. I don't disagree with you. I think we're doing it.
Just to be clear, I'd love to have that briefing, and we do disagree because I don't think the KPIs have been that good. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Lovely. Just before I start into my couple of questions, I just wanted to pick up, the Deputy Commissioner talked about a new VORG strategy coming out in July. Is that the Met's own one rather than your one that we're expecting? And when do we expect your revised VORG strategy? And when will you be ensuring the widest, most diverse range of stakeholders are properly engaged in the process for your new VORG strategy?
So yes, that is the Met's operational strategy
Right.
in terms of tackling violence against women and girls from an operational point of view. As you know, in the manifesto, the Mayor committed to refreshing the VORG strategy. That's underway in terms of the refresh. I expect and want that new VORG strategy to be out by the end of the year. In terms of consultation, yes, of course, we will want to consult and we want to make sure we have a wide range of views, including survivors and victims. But I would also say, and it doesn't mean that we won't undertake the consultation, but I would also say that we're not starting afresh, we're not starting anew. We continually consult and engage, and we have a lot of evidence as to victims and survivors, their views. Of course, we must continue to do that, but we also have a lot of evidence as to what is needed, where the gaps are, and what needs to be focused on, in more depth. So it's not the start of the, it's not that we go out and consult afresh, that we're building on the evidence, insight, and victims and survivors' insight that we have already.
There will be some engagement as you go through this
Yes,
refresh.
of course,
Lovely.
yeah.
I wanted to ask, start the questions on the court backlog and conviction rates. And I accept you and the Met are not responsible for the courts and the judicial system. Now, we've had to come out this week the government's rate review, and hands up. They've put their hands up saying it's not working. It's the system is failing there. Wondering, if I start with the Deputy Mayor and then the Met Police, what's your reaction to that? Do you think their proposed actions go far enough? And, what are you going to change with the Met and to do differently to try to resolve this huge issue of this backlog and the impact it's having on victims and witnesses?
So I think you're asking about the rape review as well in terms of the court backlogs, and they are obviously connected, but there's two slightly different things.
Okay.
If I just take the court backlogs first, I think the pandemic exacerbated what was already a major problem in the courts. We already had backlogs, we already had delays, and the pandemic has made that far, far worse. We have, huge number, especially in the Crown Court. Magistrates aren't as bad as the Crown Courts. Actually, they are beginning to not clear. I think the way that the courts or court service will talk about it is the magistrates are clearing more than they're taking in, so they are beginning to slowly clear the backlog. They're not out of the woods yet, but in terms of the Crown Court, there is a really significant problem, and that is a real issue in terms of, particularly for victims, the amount of time that they are waiting to get their cases to come to court. And if we take rape, and this is why it is connected.
That's why it's related it, because
it is totally connected. That the longer a rape victim waits, the more likely they are not to continue. The longer they wait, the more likely, it's difficult for them to cope and recover and get over the trauma. The second thing is that they need more victim support, and they need more support in terms of that wait, in terms of getting to court. So it is a real issue. We've been calling on the government to basically to fundamentally invest in the system in London. We need what we call a super court. We haven't got one. There's one in Manchester, there's one in Loughborough, just been announced in Loughborough.
Yeah.
London needs one because we are not clearing the complex multi-handed cases that we need to clear. And rape victims are, not just rape victims, victims of serious and complex crime are suffering because of that, because of the delay. In terms of the rate review that came out last week, myself and Claire Waxman, the London Victims Commissioner, have really welcomed that report, because it's a step. I'm optimistic. I think it could be a step change in how rape cases are investigated by the police, how rape cases and rape victims are supported through the system. But it's been 2 years in the making. There are still pilots in there. You know, for example, Section 28 pre-recorded video evidence. They should just be rolling that out. They shouldn't be testing it again. I think it's been tested since 2014. It's a question of funding that is needed there. There is also a question, you know, for example, in terms of there are other pilots in there. I think they should just get on and really do this urgently. In terms of our role in that, we, MOPAC and Claire, the Victims Commissioner, undertook a really groundbreaking rate review published in 2019. I'm really pleased the government have taken up many of the recommendations that she made, and many of the recommendations are in that rate review as well as in the rape and serious sexual assaults action plan. So, for example, pre-charge advisory meetings between the CPS and the Met. That's in the RASO action plan. It's in the rape review. I'm really, really pleased about that. The other major piece of work that MOPAC has been leading is on looking at how the police investigate rape. Working with Sarah Crew, the National Police Lead on that, and Avon and Somerset Police. Operation Bluestone took place in Avon and Somerset. MOPAC had been working with Betsy Stanko, and that took place in Avon and Somerset. And there will be 4 more forces where that is going to be rolled out to. It should, I think, fundamentally change the way in which rape has been investigated. It seems an odd thing to say. It will focus on the offender, not on the victim. That is, you know, what the Operation Bluestone in Avon and Somerset showed was that I think about 25% of the cases that they looked at, there was a repeat offender in there, but they'd never been identified. Many of them had never even been spoken to. So there's a real fundamental change, yes, around victim support, but actually in investigating allegations of rape in the way that you would investigate an allegation of really serious assault from, you know, not a sexual crime. MOPAC and London have led the way on that, and I really hope that that will make a fundamental difference.
I don't know if Deputy Commissioner, you want to comment on that. I have kind of, for time, tried to put 2 issues together, but I think, you know, if you've been a victim of a sexual assault or rape, then actually, more than any case, you want that concluded as soon as possible through the courts. You don't want to be having to wait years before you hopefully see justice. So what's your reaction to the rape review, and what are you doing differently? Particularly, there's been criticism about the quality of the case files, and it probably picks up from what the Deputy Mayor is saying. The quality of what's being passed to the CPS means that lots of cases don't even make it to court. So just wondering what you're going to be doing around that, please.
Okay, thank you. There were a few things I wanted to say about this. So just briefly, very briefly, in relation to the Crown Court backlog, it's getting worse, not better.
Yeah. So
CPS figures that we've been given recently suggest that in February 20, so before COVID, the backlog was 3,400. In May 21, so a month ago, it was 7,200. This month, it's 7,300. Yeah. So we're seeing the backlog getting worse, and justice will be delayed for longer for victims in going through Crown Court. Magistrate courts are going in the right direction in London. So I support what the Mayor said. The Deputy Mayor said about the court capacity in London. It's a challenge for us. In relation to the review that came out from the government this week, again, I would agree with the Deputy Mayor on it. It's great that this has reached the level of concern that it has. I have to say, and you know, we've discussed this on numerous occasions at this panel. We have been concerned about it for a number of years. It's important to say that the figures that the Met have and our performance is not unique to the Met. It's a national trend. There's been a downtrend in rape detections, reaching back to the disclosure case of R.V. Allen a few years ago. Allegations are up. The mix is much more challenging. Members will know, but it is worth reminding people that the vast majority of rape and sexual offences reported to us are not stranger attacks. That they happen, but the vast majority of the stranger attacks we detect. The ones that we deal with, and the big bulk of rape and sexual assaults, are actually where the people are in a relationship or have been in a relationship. The act itself is not in question. That's not what is being challenged in the justice process. It's the circumstances that are, and effectively it's about consent. So that means that all the forensic issues are irrelevant. It's not usually going to be solved through forensics. Consent is the key, and that's where digital evidence will come into play, both on the victim and on the offender's side, and perhaps on witnesses' sides as well. Communication digitally are far more likely before and after the event. And these are key to any court case, which means we need the digital devices, and we know the controversy that causes. It's an invasion of privacy for the victim. It's a huge inconvenience for the victim because we all live our lives on mobile phones these days. Our lack of sufficient digital forensics means that there is a delay built in there. At the moment, the delay is around about 4 months to get, in the more complex cases, to get phones and devices downloaded and the evidence looked at. We don't yet have the technology, so we can download it, but we're downloading sometimes terabytes of information. And it's then up to the investigating officer to manually go through that, to look at third-party information, as we know, is also a difficulty. So we welcome any move by the government to appreciate the complexities of this. But I'm bound to say that our officers are working really hard on this. Their workloads are too high, and we need more resources for that. It's as simple as that. We need more people to investigate the increasing numbers that we are seeing in rape and sexual offences coming to us. In terms of the quality, the Attorney General has introduced a new policy, which means that we have to do more work pre-charge in relation to individual cases, and we are seeing I believe we're seeing our quality of our case files improve. There is a difficulty with rape, and it goes back to the issue of consent, that it is often a case that we can put a case to the jury and the jury will then decide. And I'm not going to comment, because I don't know enough about it, on juries' attitudes to rape trials. But we know how difficult it is for victims to give evidence, and I support what the Deputy Mayor said about video evidence. These are highly complex areas. It's not for want of trying in relation to this, but we do have a lack of resources in this area. Our investigators carry too heavy a workload, and all of our officers and staff who support victims of sexual assaults through the court cases have too high a workload. And the court backlogs have not helped with that, because they're not able to clear the cases, but new cases keep coming in.
Could you just expand a bit on what ways you are supporting victims of rape and sexual assault who are waiting for cases to be heard? What more is needed? Obviously, you're saying resource, that's people, that's funding, that's digital forensic capability. But what are you doing to support those victims who are trying to get justice through this process?
So we have, as the Deputy Mayor said, we have asked to be part of Operation Bluestone, which is the national approach, which we'll look at, and we also want to look at our sexual offences officers to make sure that they're doing complementary work with the ISVAs, with the Independent Sexual Violence Advisors, and make sure that we're not duplicating there. We have put more money into our support officers who support the victims of rape and sexual assault through court. So I think we've been given an extra £1 million by the government to increase the numbers there. I think we've increased the numbers by about 12 members of staff to support the victims, because as I think I reported to the last PCC, because of the backlogs, we've seen a large increase in the number of victims who are still going through the process of the justice processes. So we've increased the number of support officers to try to keep the victims engaged and informed and supported through the process. So we're looking at that. We're also reviewing in a fundamental way how we deal with rape investigations and sexual assaults, and we'll learn from Operation Bluestone. We'll listen to what the government is saying. I understand the comments about, we're going to change our approach and be offender focused. Of course it makes sense, and nobody should be surprised. I mean, we're a law enforcement agency. We're there to put people into the criminal justice system, and we want to catch offenders. But we have to be careful that doesn't give the impression that we've not been focused on offenders. Of course we're focused on offenders. That's what we're here to do. but we've also massively increased our support for the victims, because if we don't support the victims, then they will withdraw from the process, because it's such a long and complex and traumatic process for them. And without their support, it's incredibly difficult to pursue the offenders. So you can't simply switch all your resources from one to the other. There has to be a balance to this, which we are working hard to maintain that balance by supporting victims, but focusing on offenders.
Lovely, thank you. Look forward to seeing how some of these changes practiced. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, just in terms of practicalities of how victims have been supported. Yes. Once it became clear that the court backlogs were a really, significant issue and that they were not being cleared, myself and Claire Waxman convened the partners in London to try to, basically to go through the data and to go through the detail and to prioritise those victims, to understand the number of victims who were waiting, how long they were waiting, but also who was vulnerable and who needed extra support, and working with the Met and partners to reach out to them, to offer them support again, to remind them that support is there. We have also, as from MOPAC, and all credit to the government on this, we have had additional resources given to us. I think it's about £5 million for more, not just independent sexual violence advocates, but also IDFAs as well, to try to make sure that we can meet the demand. I don't think we are meeting the demand. The Deputy Commissioner is absolutely right around caseload, but it's also around caseload of support workers. It is a real issue in terms of demand for services. There was a gap already, and now there's just such long waiting times. It's a real problem.
Lovely, thank you very much, Chair.
Chair, could I just, I'm sorry, I missed out something quite important. Could I just come back in briefly?
Please do, please do.
Yeah, so members may well know, we've already set up our predatory offender unit as well, which is 108 officers across London, who are very, very focused on repeat offenders and in relation to sexual offences. Not solely sexual offences, but the fact that we're talking about violent predatory offenders indicates that there is a big focus on sexual offenders. And the Deputy Mayor and the Minister for Policing saw the work of the predatory offender units on one of our DCUs very recently, and that they're doing some great work. But we have also put 12 extra staff into our victim support units as well, and witness support units, to try to deal with the increase in the workload. So we have put more resources in where we see there is pressure, but I would re-emphasise the pressure on the investigators is enormous at the moment, and it's a very, very traumatic area to work. And we simply need more resource to increase the number of investigators, which will improve our timeliness, and it will improve the quality of the case files and the support we can give to victims and the focus we can bring on offenders. But the predatory offender unit, which we've had in place for quite a while now, I think 6 months or maybe even 9 months, has a very strong focus on the offender to get them into the criminal justice system and bring them to justice.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Just had, thank you, Chair, just one brief follow-up, which was just possibly more for the Commissioner, just in relation to the comments you've made about the courts and the backlog. What are the numbers like and the support like in terms of using the domestic violence protection orders? How have those numbers gone up or down? It'd be really helpful to understand if there's respite being given to women and their children whilst they're living through that period of time.
I can't give you a specific answer at the moment. I will write to you, but I do know from research I've already had done that we've seen an increase in our application of Clare's law, so the right to know. We've seen a big increase in that, and we've seen an increase also in protection orders as well. But I can write to you with the specific numbers, which I'm afraid I don't have in my brief.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to carry on?
Very quick intervention, Chair. Thank you. The government's alternative to the Domestic Abusers Register and the work done by the College of Policing is quite clear. The argument is you have the powers to do an abusers register in a different way. Will we see that in the new operational plans of the VORG about explaining what powers are available to commands across London, so we can get some consistently in terms of actions and follow up and target the most serious domestic violence abusers?
So I am working very closely with Assistant Commissioner Nick Fgrave, and I know he's spoken to the Deputy Mayor about this. There is a fundamental issue with domestic abuse at the moment, which is it is an extremely wide definition and goes beyond the traditional definition of domestic abuse was focused on individuals involved in an intimate relationship. The definition was expanded years ago to be much wider than that, to include familial relationships as well, which means, you know, children and parents, brothers and sisters in a non-sexual relationship. And whenever you speak to, as I do quite regularly, officers who are working in the domestic abuse areas of public protection, they will say that one of the reasons their workload is so high is because they are dealing with a huge number of files, and many of them are very, very minor familial disputes. The classic one being two brothers falling out over who's got control of the television remote, and one punches the other. That is included in the definition of domestic abuse, and it shouldn't be, in my candid opinion. We should be focusing on the more serious sexual and non-sexual but predatory or intimidatory behaviour and controlling behaviour within intimate relationships, either current or previous relationships. So I think that's an important thing to focus on. We need a consistency around that. That will give us a greater focus on the people that I believe, and will reduce the numbers down to a number that our officers can grapple with and deal with effectively. In terms of creating a domestic violence register, if it was focused on those sort of things, then I personally have more support for it. But if it is a register based on everybody who commits domestic abuse under the current definition, then frankly, I think it's not workable. Not in the volumes that we deal with.
We've never suggested that, and we've never suggested that, but that's not an excuse not to do anything about targeting and prioritising issues of risk, which is what you do every day in your policing activities. What we're asking for is consistency in domestic abuse cases, taking into account some of the factors, but also how do we target the most violent abusers that exist within our society, and where are the police on those, and some of the cases around that. Now, in terms of that, pre-COVID, Deputy Commissioner, I asked you some questions around outcomes of, you know, the normal response calls, and I know that in your response to me, you said that that you didn't believe that any response call would go without an outcome. It doesn't have to be a judicial outcome. It could be a follow-up issue, not even done by the response officer, albeit they're carrying caseloads. It could be done by ward teams. It could be done by other partners locally, just to check in the victim. We know that some of these encounters lead to murder. That's what we're trying to reduce down, or increase violence, or have an adverse impact on young people that may witness it or be part of the abuse itself, physical abuse itself. So in that sense, where have you got to in terms of the monitoring of the outcomes back at base, down at that front line level of when they come back and say, well, no response to that, it's all quiet, to be honest. Are we winning on that basis? Are you confident that that piece of best practice is now existing across the MPS in its many forms of where they may encounter these emergency calls?
So Commander Mel Dales, who I think has spoken with members about these issues, is the day-to-day lead on the public protection issues, and she has a dashboard of indicators to show how we're doing in response to domestic abuse. She reports into Nick Fgrave, who is, as you probably know, running a review of all of our public protection machinery throughout the organisation, with a very clear focus on improving our detection rate in relation to domestic abuse. But again, I do repeat, where we do well in relation to domestic abuse is when we attend the scene and the offence is ongoing or very recent. We will deal with it. Where it becomes more difficult for us is in the area, and again, it's back to digital, where, because we're looking at coercive and controlling behaviour or harassment or stalking, it's often done on a digital platform. It's not done person to person. That is an area of greater challenge for us because it requires more investigation. It's not an immediate investigation, and it requires more follow-up from officers. Where officers attend domestic abuse incidents and there is an ongoing incident and there is a clear offence, then I'm very confident that in the vast majority of cases, officers will take the appropriate action and there will be the right outcome as a result of that. It's the other cases where I think there are problems.
Well, no doubt we'll return to this when we see your operational plan, but in terms of using all the tools available to you to battle this particularly pernicious crime within our communities.
Thank you. Just before we move on from this, Commissioner, just to pick up this point, it did sound in your answer that you're saying because of the definition around domestic abuse, you've dragged your heels on using the powers you have to set up a register. It cannot be beyond the wit of man to draw a level as to who would be on this register or not. Why are we having a conversation about we can't have this list because it'll be too long? Surely we set a benchmark of where we'd be recording people or not.
Well, I didn't mean to give the impression we're dragging our heels because of that. The view of the organisation at the moment is that the idea of a domestic abuse register, whilst it sounds like a perfect solution, would be a huge volume for London and would not help us focus in on the more serious cases. I personally, if we can get to a more to boiling down to the more serious cases to focus, I would be supportive of that. But we already prioritise. So we already have, as I said, the Predatory Offenders Unit that looks at the more serious cases on domestic abuse that the BCUs can't deal with because it needs more investigation or more technique than they can provide for themselves. So we have an element that looks at prioritisation. And I actually think the register, and this is the point I was trying to make, obviously didn't make it effectively, if the register includes all domestic abuse cases, then it won't help us prioritise. It will detract from us prioritising.
One second, member. One second.
I think it's very important.
Hold on.
So no one is suggesting the police do a register of every domestic violence issue. No one has said that, even through the legislation, through the Houses of Commons. I'm not understanding why the Deputy Commissioner is raising it in that way. We're not asking for that ourselves on the Assembly. No pressure groups are saying everyone has to be on that grading. It's a question of using some of the work that the Metropolitan Police has already done, such as Dauntless Plus operation of where you've targeted the most violent on your criteria. So no one is suggesting all courses. And Chair, I do have to intervene because I hear this from the Deputy Commissioner and I just think it's important because I'm not suggesting he's using it, but it comes across like we will never ever get there when we know that police do prioritise these issues. The question is, it needs to be in a consistent and systematic way. There has been work done by the College of Policing pointing to various tools and best practice that can bring us closer to that without having a full register. That's what the government is suggesting in terms of their responses to others who are calling, including us, for an abusers register. The more this carries on, the more it looks like we're going to have an abusers register. It may not be in this legislation, but it's likely to be in a future legislation. It just seems to me that what we're asking for is consistency and an approach tackling the most violent and the most particular difficult cases. It doesn't pick up other cases unless they reach a threshold. It's for you as professionals and others involved that need to determine what that threshold looks like, and the courts, no one's suggesting here it's every one of your cases.
Excuse me, Commissioner, I agree, and that's why I was trying to stop you. The point being, I'm trying to make, Commissioner, your units that are targeting these offenders anyway seem to have already done the work. they have a level that makes them focus on the most prolific, most violent offenders. So surely half the work's already been done. And it doesn't seem to me like we're asking for any particular new innovation. We're just asking for the list because, of course, the power in the list is it's historic. It will allow you to identify people over time who are repeat offenders and defend the public from them. I don't see why, if you're already doing the work, we can't have the list if you do have the powers.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we're almost... We're almost furiously agreeing here. We want to prioritise, and we are prioritising. That's exactly the work that Nick Esgrave is leading now, is to create the model that will allow us to prioritise so that our investigating officers in public protection can focus on the most serious cases.
Okay.
Can I just say that I think there's a slight misunderstanding. The Metropolitan Police do not have the powers to set up a register in the way that a sex offenders register is there. There aren't those powers. There has been lobbying to get powers into the DA bill. That was turned down by the government. What the Deputy Commissioner is talking about is how does the Metropolitan Police manage the most violent offenders? Now, the Met does have a way of managing the most violent offenders. But what we need to make sure, I need to be assured of, as do you as a committee, is how effective is that and how effective is the Met at managing the risk, because sometimes, and this is a separate issue to the register, sometimes low risk can escalate very, very quickly to high risk, as you can see in some of the domestic homicide reviews that if you look at them. But in terms of the register, there's two things. The Met do not have the power to set that up. What we've been calling for is that for the effectiveness of forces to manage the most violent offenders in relation to domestic abuse to be really, really scrutinised, and therefore to be assurance and reviewed. And if that is not of effectiveness for that review, for there to be a register, because that is one way of ensuring that happens. Now, the policing courts and sentencing bill may well be a vehicle for that domestic abuse register and the review of it to take place. But at the moment, the Met can operationalise high risk, and prioritise, but it does not have the powers to set up a register in the way that the domestic abuse register is envisaged.
That, but we are pressed for time, so we'll pick this up when we do domestic violence as a separate issue, because I think there's things they can do operationally in practice to deliver a better outcome. But I move on to the next question, which I believe is from me. Here we go. What volume of victims and witnesses of violence against women and girls are accessing London's Victim Witness Service? And that's to the Deputy Mayor.
I'll have to, in terms of those who are, everybody should be offered the support services, London Victims and Witness Service. I'll have to come back to you in terms of the proportion of those that take it up, because they will be contacted and they will be offered it. Not everybody takes that up. We also have what we call the Sexual Violence Gateway, that the London Victims and Witness Service will refer victims of sexual violence to, but I don't have that in my briefing in terms of the percentage of individuals and how the percentage and proportion that actually take it up.
Thank you. If you could write to me as chair of the committee, and I'll disseminate information. Thank you. And this is a question for both of you. What progress has been made by the Met and the CPS in London following the publication of the National Joint Rape and Serious Sexual Offence Action Plan in January 2021? To start with the Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I touched on it earlier in terms of the rape review being part of that as well. But I mean, for example, one of the elements of progress from that action plan is the early investigative advice between the CPS and the Metropolitan Police. That was actually a recommendation in Claire Waxman's rape review, which was published 2 years ago, taken into the action plan, and that is now happening. So we can, that's a sort of input. Can we see that changing the figures at the moment? I don't think we're at that stage yet, but there's certainly something. There are early signs that there's the right focus in terms of that action plan around the CPS and the Metropolitan Police and investigation and case file quality.
Thank you. Deputy Commissioner, would you like to add a comment?
Yeah, sure. So we've taken the joint plan, and we have a joint implementation plan with the CPS here in London. I'm looking at it now. We have 48 actions in that implementation plan. All have got either owners of the CPS the police, all their joint actions. They've all got, as you would expect to see, timelines on them, and they're all graded in terms of how we're doing in relation to it. It's probably something that you need somebody who's closer to the implementation plan than I am to talk through, but I can give you assurances that we are working together on the implementation of that work through this joint plan, and I can see progress being made in some of them. Other areas still look as though they're challenging, but there is a determination by both agencies to work together on this to improve our detection rate in relation to these issues.
Thank you for that. We will try to get in contact with someone who is close to that plan when we look at domestic violence and rape as well, so they can give us that. Would it be possible for you to give us your 48 points in writing, or do we need to go to them?
Oh, I can certainly let you see what they are, yes. I could talk them through you if you had the time, all 48 of them. I've got them in front of me, but yeah, we can certainly let you have, let you see what the plan looks like, yes.
Please write to us, because it will be the basis for our questions we ask in that session. Assembly Member Rogers.
Chair, so how is the Met and MOPAC working with partners such as TfL and the British Transport Police?
Chair, sorry, I think we have skipped a whole area of the violence against women and girls line of questioning and moved on to
Sorry,
transport.
I thought you'd asked all your questions.
No, that was to follow on from that previous question.
Yeah, okay, I thought it was you'd keep going, and because you didn't keep going, I assumed.
Sorry, it's only my second committee. I wasn't aware of that. That's the first time that's happened.
No need to apologise. Why don't I let you come in now, and Nick will circle back to you, because I want to try and keep my order flowing as best as possible.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about, I know you've kind of covered some of these areas already, but just specific actions that you're taking to increase the number of rape and sexual assault cases going to court. I know you've talked about doing lots more I forgot the term that you used, but doing a lot more work before getting to that point. But if you could just talk us through that, would be really helpful. I'm assuming that's to me, that question. Yes, it's to both of you, to the Deputy Mayor and you, Deputy Commissioner. Okay, so I suppose I don't want to repeat what I've already said. We are carrying out a major review of public protection to look at the resourcing levels within public protection to make sure that they are as good as they can be. The workload on our investigators, particularly on rape and sexual offences, we know is too high. As is the workload on our witness support staff as well, because of the backlogs. We put more money into witness support, put an extra £1 million into that to try to increase the numbers of officers and staff to reduce the workload so they can give better support. We are seeing still, because of the Crown Court delays, the numbers of victims in the system is growing, not reducing, which is difficult for us. We are signed up to the Operation Bluestone, which will take a look at different ways of dealing with rape cases, and we're working very closely with the CPS to try to improve our detection rates. And I just talked about the implementation plan that is there. We've established the predatory offender unit with I think it's 6 or 108 officers across London, focusing on the more serious predatory offenders that are there's too much investigation to be done. It's going to take too long. All the techniques required and the tactics required are beyond the public protection teams. So they will hand the more serious cases to the predatory offender units. So there's quite a lot of plans in action. We've got Commander Mel Dales, who is very, very closely monitoring our performance in this area to try to improve our detection rate in relation to rape. And we are working closely with the CPS to try to improve file quality and to get decisions made quicker so that we can progress things quicker. One of the big blockages is the digital evidence and forensics that I talked about, where we are still waiting for the rollout of technology which can, using artificial intelligence, can help the investigator zero in on the relevant material that needs to go to the prosecution file to be passed to the defence, because we're dealing with so much digital information when we download the phones that we still struggle with that, and that causes a delay as well. But we are working on all these fronts to try to improve how we are providing a service to the victims and get more offenders brought to justice. Thank you.
Assembly
I may ask a question on the back of that, Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Can we be succinct?
Yes, absolutely. This is to both of you. So as you both know, since 2010, there's been a 25% cut to the Ministry of Justice budget. Both the Crown Prosecution Service and the police have highlighted this lack of resources to deal with rape cases. Are you surprised that the lack of resources wasn't mentioned in the review as a factor for the sharp drop-off in rape case convictions since 2016, and therefore would you have welcomed a greater financial package to assist with the issues?
I think actually I'm afraid I wasn't surprised, unfortunately, because it was this government that implemented the cuts, and it's very difficult to then turn around and say that you've got that wrong and that you have seriously impacted people's lives and you have let rape become normalised, not normalised, but basically people are getting away with rape. So that is a very difficult thing for anybody to turn around and admit to. However, it is really clear that the lack of going forward, never mind looking back in terms of the cuts to CPS, cuts to the courts and cuts to the police, going forward, if there is to be a significant step change in the way in which rape is prosecuted, investigated and victims are supported, we need long-term funding, and we need a step change in that funding. The rape review that came out last week has funding for a year, just a year, for this new way for Operation Bluestone. I welcome that. However, we need it beyond a year, and we also need the victim services beyond the year. And as the Deputy Commissioner's made clear, the police need the resources so that the caseload of the investigating officers is not so high that they cannot undertake the investigations in the way that they wish to. It is a real burden on the police that they haven't got enough officers, enough detectives in order to be able to carry out the investigations.
Thank you.
I think in answer to that question, particularly, I'd limit myself to saying that clearly it's a criminal justice system. So where any part of it is suffering through lack of resources, it will impact on the whole system, and it will impact on the victims and the dealing with the offenders.
Chair, just on the back of something that the Deputy Mayor said, I think as a committee we do need to acknowledge, I know she corrected herself, but actually if something is not challenged and dealt with in the courts and people are allowed to get away with things, it does become normal behaviour. So therefore I would actually say that rape, because of the way that it's been dealt with at the moment, lack of resources, one of the big issues here, it has become normalised. And I think we really do need to note that and understand what that means.
To be very clear, I don't agree. I don't think rape has been normalised. It's a massive issue for us, yes, as this committee has been discussing this morning and we'll discuss in the future as part of our investigation into domestic violence, of course, domestic abuse, of which rape often appears. So I don't think rape has been normalised. That's a very sweeping statement which has had great ramifications. Do we have enough resources spent on it? We could have an argument which would probably come to a conclusion, no. But we do have a government, a committee, a mayor, a police service that are focused on turning around the very poor record we have with dealing with rape, which would lead me not to use the word normalised. I think normalised suggests that we are comfortable with the situation, and I don't think any of the parties involved are comfortable with the situation. Assembly Member Rogers.
Yeah. So how is the Met and MOPAC working with partners such as Transport for London, the British Transport Police, to tackle and prevent sexual assault and harassment on London's transport network? Deputy Commissioner, would you like to address this first?
I can. Sorry, I'd flicked too far there, and I do have some information on that, and I'm now struggling to find it. Apologies. Yeah. So we've got the Roads Transport and Policing Command have implemented a number of initiatives in relation to sexual offences and in general, actually, violence against women and girls. So what we're looking at is safe places which are run at the main bus hub on each borough, and we advertise those on Twitter accounts. Dedicated police officers are posted to the main transport hub to provide reassurance, advice and support to people who are feeling vulnerable. And we've looked at the shift patterns and the number of officers that we have on at different times of the day, and we have adjusted those as a result of the concerns that we all feel about violence against women and girls in public spaces, and that goes for roads policing networks as well, and the roads policing command as well. We provided a publicised dedicated space for people to go to when they felt unsafe. We have looked at putting extra patrols into transport hubs to make sure that there is a visible police presence wherever possible, either police officers or police community support officers, to make sure that the public is much of police officers. And we work incredibly closely with the British Transport Police and TfL, looking at where the vulnerable areas are for people to make sure that we are in the right places. The same goes for bus hubs as it does for train overground and underground hubs as well.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. So tens of thousands of these sorts of incidents go unreported. Deputy Mayor, what are you doing to address this? How are you working with partners?
In terms of the work that the Met and TfL and British Transport Police are undertaking, I mean, I think the biggest campaign, the most successful campaign, has been the Report It to Stop It campaign. Really well researched and well evidenced campaign from TfL, supported by the Met and supported by City Hall, to encourage those that are, to encourage those that are victim to sexual harassment, although it was called unwanted sexual attention, because that was what the evidence showed that would actually cut through to people, that they had got, that they had become victims of that, rather than calling it sexual harassment, which I found interesting, because I queried that when it was being, when we were, clearing it to be launched, as why aren't we calling it sexual harassment? But it's been a really well evidenced and well delivered campaign to encourage people to report. And you're absolutely right, there is a real issue of underreporting. So that means many women are being subject to sexual harassment that they shouldn't be subject to. But it also means it is much harder to detect. And one of the key messages actually of the Report to Stop It campaign was, your report will help catch those sexually harassing people on the tube, because it will become part of the wider intelligence that British Transport Police, TfL and the Met can use. I mean,
the Report It to Stop It campaign has been going for a few years now, hasn't it? And despite that, I'm sure it was a very well put together, very well researched campaign. There's still massive underreporting. Only 2% of people in one study who have experienced this kind of harassment are reporting. Is there current work or planned work into looking into why there is this reluctance to report?
Yes, of course, and you're right, we still have a problem with underreporting, although we have seen an increase in reporting as well. So there has been, it has made progress, that campaign. We are discussing with TfL, British Transport Police and the Met around, what next for Report It to Stop It, how do we encourage women to come forward? And of course it does link into all the other discussions we've had today in terms of the why would you report? One, around confidence and assurance of women that something will be done. And then the second thing is, well, what will be done and how long will that take? What are is it worth it? So that all these discussions link up, not just in terms of how do we encourage women to report, how do we make that particular campaign more successful, is how does the whole system become better at responding to the victimisation, the way in which women are being sexually harassed or abused in public spaces.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can we move on to Assemblymember Russell, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And this is a change of topic. We're looking at Vision Zero roads policing. So just to start off with just a little bit of context, the latest data, the year for which we have data is 2019. And in that year, 125 people were killed in road traffic collisions and 3,950 people were seriously injured. And serious injury is something like losing a leg or something that is a life-changing injury for a Londoner. So I just wanted to put that context onto these questions. So my first question is for the Deputy Commissioner. As lockdown restrictions are eased, how are you ensuring that there are sufficient resources in the Met's Road Traffic Policing Command to tackle any increase in road traffic collisions? We've seen a lot of extreme speeding and things reported during this lockdown period. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question. So, yes, I think the figures you quoted were 2019. So, in terms of 2020, as you might expect, we saw a reduction. So we had 94 fatalities in 2020, and so far this year to up to almost just last week, we've had 28 fatalities, and sort of similar patterns with serious injuries as well. So a dip in 2020. Interestingly, though, the one aspect that we were probably all aware of in relation to COVID year, in particular on the roads, was a significant increase in speeding offences. So I think the thing I would say is that we had no relaxation in terms of our traffic enforcement in COVID year, and we had no reduction to speak of the number of officers that we have focused on that. So the Roads Transport Policing Command has got over 2,000 officers and staff in its command, and it's sort of made up of about 450 traditional, what you would call roads policing officers who do patrolling and respond to incidents. It's got a crime team. It's got a commercial vehicle unit. It's got a reassurance and tasking team, which provides. It's made up mainly of police community support officers, which provide highly focused presence across London. And they're the sort of people I mentioned who provide presence in the safer hubs. We have a motorcycle team that provide motorcycle safety advice, a serious collision investigation unit of about 75 officers to deal with the major collisions, particularly the fatalities that we talk about. And obviously a big bulk of the numbers is our safer transport team who police the TfL network, and that's around about just over 1,100 officers. So we haven't reduced those numbers in the last few years. They remain focused on a number of issues, but Vision Zero, one of them, road safety, but also the use of the road network by criminals. If I just finish off just by talking what I mentioned earlier, the speeding issue really is quite stark. So in terms of speeding offences, in 2019, we saw about 12,000 people prosecuted for speeding offences in London. In 2020, we saw 30,000 because, as you remember, there was a highly publicised, and we helped publicise it. Because the roads were quiet, we saw huge numbers of people using massively excess speed across the capital. And we really zeroed in on that to crack down on it, and hence the increase in numbers. I think the numbers will come back to a norm because we've got a volume of traffic returning to the roads, and the speeding simply is not possible. But I think the empty roads was too much of a temptation for many people to resist, and they flagrantly broke the speeding regulations and put an awful lot of lives in danger, including their own, by doing it. So we will see, I think, a return to normality this year. But we have not taken our eye off the ball in relation to roads policing and Vision Zero at all. We're some way off it, but it is something that we are determined to move towards, working in partnership with TfL and the Mayor.
Sorry, Assembly Member, just to seek a clarification. Deputy Commissioner, you say you saw an increase in speeding. Was it an actual increase in speed, or was it in the areas where you had lowered the speed limit?
No, it was an increase in speed. We saw people. So I get the thrust of what you're saying. It's not because of an increase in 20-mile-an-hour zones. We saw a massive increase in the number of people doing it highly excessive speeds across London, and it was something we had to put extra patrols into to deal with. Thank you, Assembly Member.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, certainly I was talking to Road Peace the other day, and they mentioned that you're not in the top 5 nationally, but you're doing a decent job on tackling speeding, and they were very grateful for that, because that is one of the ways that you can reduce harm and therefore reduce the likelihood of very serious collisions affecting affecting Londoners. Now, Deputy Mayor, I just wanted to ask about Vision Zero and whether you are working with the Deputy Mayor for Transport as you prepare the police and crime plan, and whether Vision Zero is how you're going to be incorporating Vision Zero or any changes in the police and crime plan.
In terms of developing the police and crime plan, we are working across City Hall and across all our partners in terms of the police and crime plan. But in particular on Vision Zero, that is, that sits under the Deputy Mayor for Transport, and it will continue to sit under the Deputy Mayor for Transport. I obviously have discussions with her around that, but in terms of oversight and delivery of Vision Zero and that work with the Metropolitan Police, that really is very much with TfL and the Deputy Mayor for Transport. So the Police and Crime Plan may well refer to it, but it will not be, there will be no changes in terms of oversight, direction, and the responsibility for Vision Zero.
Thank you. So the oversight of that sits with the Deputy Mayor for Transport, even the policing work.
Where it comes to the Road Traffic Policing Command, that oversight in terms of delivery of Vision Zero, yes, it's the TfL are very much the oversight body for that.
Thank you. That's very useful. Useful clarity. So to the Commissioner, just wondering about camera footage referrals. There's been some very strong work done by the Northampton Police, and they have hugely increased the likelihood that people who are committing offences while driving are caught, and people who are driving without due care or using their mobile know that they are much more likely to be caught doing that, and those are obviously very harmful activities. So, what are you taking any specific action to improve awareness amongst Londoners of the ability to refer dashcam and headcam footage to the police?
You're mute. You're mute.
Mute, Deputy Commissioner.
Sorry, I'm just conscious. I keep flicking pages here to keep up with the conversation.
That's fine. That's fine. Just remember to unmute yourself.
When I do that, we've seen a significant increase in the number of referrals from dash cam footage over the last few years. Obviously, it's a trend. It's a trend that is growing. It's one that we are happy to encourage, and we see a high proportion of prosecutions coming from when they are referred. It's a definite growth area for us, and it's an area where it's involvement with citizens who have dash cams, or indeed cyclists, which is quite a frequent one as well, who have cameras mounted on their helmets, is something that is growing, and one that we are encouraging. So let me just see. In 2017, there were just under 5,000 referrals around this issue. In 2020, there were 11,500. So it's grown quite substantially. And as I say, we see quite a high prosecution rate as a result of that, and it's something that we are happy to continue to encourage. The use of social media obviously has helped that, but we've also made it much easier through our technology for people to upload videos to us, so they're not having to send us anything through the post or anything prehistoric like that. They actually can upload it onto our website so that we can view it directly. And it's a high-profile way of reminding drivers that even if there isn't a police patrol in the area and there isn't a speed camera in the area, breaking the law, driving at excessive and dangerous speed, or driving without consideration for other drivers or reckless driving is something that they could well be held to account for through a third-party submission. Approximately 2/3 of the submissions that we get, as I said, in 2020 that was 11,500. 2/3 of submissions result in prosecution. So it's a high rate of prosecution that's taking place as a result of citizen reporting.
Thank you. That's really useful to know. Is this data published anywhere? You mentioned, the sort of the numbers of submissions and the you said 2/3 of the submissions result in prosecution. I just
Yes.
wondered if that data is published.
I don't know the answer to that, but I see no reason why it shouldn't be. And it should be publicised. So I'm grateful for you asking the question, quite frankly, and we can take steps to make sure that it is publicised.
Great, that would be, if
To
you
be fair, it probably has been already, but we can repeat that.
that would be extremely helpful. So then my final question is about e-scooters, and clearly e-scooters used on the pavement are wrong, they're illegal, they desperately need to be speed limited and regulated, and hopefully the current trial is going to lead to some sensible regulation of these things which exist and have been invented. Now, my questions are about the way that they are being their use is being policed. Now, obviously, there's the trial, and the trial scooters are the legal ones, and those are allowed to be used. Anyone who is using a personally owned e-scooter is currently engaged in an illegal activity. But what people are concerned about is the difference in approach to policing e-scooter use to policing people driving cars and committing activity that is as harmful to other citizens. So apparently 800 e-scooters have been confiscated this year, and they've also been described, I think, by one of your colleagues as a death trap in the Evening Standard. Now, I'm just wondering whether you have data showing that e-scooters are more harmful than cars in collisions with pedestrians and people riding bikes, and also what the rate of confiscation of property of people committing serious harm with a car or other vehicle, whether you are confiscating vehicles in the way that you're confiscating e-scooters.
So I think what I would start off by replying to the question by saying I think part of the answer is in your question. So unless you're using an e-scooter on private premises or as part of the pilot, it's unlawful. The same isn't true of vehicles, of cars. So I don't think it's a relatively fair comparison, if I'm honest with you. If you're using an e-scooter on a public road and you're not taking part in the pilot with a properly designed e-scooter, then you're actually breaking the law anyway. If you're using a car, then you have to commit an offence in relation to driving or documentation before we can take any action against you. The simple fact that you're riding an e-scooter on a public road and you're not in the pilot area means you're actually it's unlawful. The use is unlawful.
Yes,
because it's a motor vehicle and you're not insured.
I opened my questions by confirming that I understand that the use of e-scooters
I get that. So
is
I'm just saying the
unlawful.
comparison I think is difficult.
But the comparison is to people who are using vehicles, committing offences in their use of a vehicle. So there are people who break speed limits. There are people who drive uninsured vehicles, and I think that what is being commented on by some Londoners is the different, the sort of understandable approach to policing e-scooters, but do we need to be a bit more serious about some of the policing of the offences that are offences by people driving vehicles, which cause harm?
So in 2021, we proceeded against 23,500 drivers for insurance offences. And in 2020, we revoked 1,500 driving licences because of offences and other things. So I wouldn't want anyone to imagine we don't take action against drivers who are either driving unlawfully or dangerously, because we do. In fact, that's effectively what the Roads Policing Unit lives to do. It's their meat and drink, as it were. But you're quite correct. We have seized a large number of scooters. I think your figures are understandably slightly out of date because we had a week of action on e-scooters last week, and in that week alone we seized 500. So I think the numbers are well over the number that you were quoting in terms of e-scooters. I have to say that we're here to enforce legislation to try and keep the roads as safe as possible. We're seeing people injured, 68 people seriously injured in 2020 with e-scooters. Not in London this year or last year. We didn't have a fatality, but in 2019 we think we may have done. And certainly there was a famous case in West Midlands where somebody has been killed as a result of an e-scooter collision. So their unlawful use is dangerous, and we will continue to seize them where they are unlawful, as we will seize cars that are used unlawfully and in crime, and where drivers are breaking the law in a serious way. Otherwise, we'll take action against them through the courts for no insurance, no MOT, no driving licence, or speeding.
Yes, I think the other thing though is that these e-scooter riders, they're having their property seized. They're also there's one here being quoted as having 6 points on his driving licence. And
unlawful, so you shouldn't be doing it.
Absolutely, no, I agree. But there is a perception that the number of points that people driving get are much lower than for people who are using e-scooters. And the e-scooters, yes, they're causing harm, but it's a fraction of the 3,950 serious injuries in that year 2019.
I agree with that. It is a fraction, but you could just for clarity, we don't award points. The courts do that. So if there's a conception of a disparity in penalisation, then that's possibly for other part of the criminal justice system as well as.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we now move on to our fourth and final area with Mesh Desai?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Deputy Mayor and Deputy Commissioner. I have some questions to ask you about hate crime. So my first question is to both of you. Last summer specifically, when lockdown restrictions were lifted, we saw an increase in hate crime in London. What work are you doing, both of you, to ensure that the same pattern does not again emerge this summer? And very specifically, what lessons did you learn from last year to better inform your approach to tackling hate crime, particularly in the areas of community cohesion and encouraging more reporting? Deputy Mayor, if you could start off with you.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of the incidence of hate crime last year. I don't think we have seen a rise in particularly anti-Semitism. It's not always connected with lockdown easing. It's also connected with geopolitical events like the tensions in the Middle East, as we've already discussed this morning anyway, around protests. So in terms of hate crime, unfortunately, we really have seen an increase. I mean, the Community Security Trust have reported the huge increase in the number of incidents that were reported to them in May. I think it was 350 incidents reported to them in May. Massive step up in anti-Semitism. In relation to what we are doing to try to ensure, I mean, the Deputy Commissioner will be able to talk in terms of the Met's operational response, but ourselves in City Hall, we have a very good network of community organisations and a very good outreach and engagement with them. So, for example, I have met with community leaders from the Jewish community, as has the Deputy Mayor for Community Cohesion and Social Justice, and we will continue to do that. And MOPAC and other parts of City Hall, for example, have regular engagement with Community Security Trust, and we fund, small amounts of money, but we have funded them as well and continue to fund them. In terms of reporting, one of the key issues is the reporting of hate crime. And whilst we've seen incidents go up, we know that it's like underreporting of sexual harassment. We know that it is very seriously underreported. The Crime Survey for England and Wales, for example, estimates that it's about 50% underreported incidents of hate crime. So again, it is about that assurance, that engagement, that communication for people not to put up with hate crime, not to put up with the abuse that they are experiencing, but to report it. And if they don't feel strong, assured enough to report it straight to the Metropolitan Police, there are third-party mechanisms to do so, like Tell Mama and other organisations as well. So we have spent, we are reaching out, communicating that, but we are also, the Mayor has also, for example, invested in the Shared Endeavour Fund, which has funded 30 organisations, grassroots organisations working in the community to tackle hate. So we're we're working, you know, when hate does happen, but also working very hard in terms of community cohesion, education for young people, and online as well, to try and prevent hate arising in the first place.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Deputy Commissioner, your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, so what we, at the strategic level, we have established a Pan-London Hate Crime Board for the first time. It's chaired by a Commander. MOPAC sit on that, so do the Home Office, and we have Chief Executive representation on that group from various community and faith groups across London. As you will well know, we have a large number of community forums and IAGs across the city, and we've been working with them in terms of education on the different ways of reporting hate crimes to the police or using third-party methods of reporting. We've also raised awareness of hate crime via the Met social media platforms so that people are more confident to report, and also that people understand, and I don't mean to sound inappropriate, but people understand what a hate crime is, which hopefully will try to restrain some people's behaviour at various events. We work in collaboration with a number of third-party reporting organisations. The Deputy Mayor's mentioned Tell Mama. We've got protection approaches. We work with the CST, the Community Safety Trust, the London Jewish Forum, Sikh community groups and Black community groups around this. We've run webinars with different groups, particularly the Chinese and Southeast Asian community, about the impact of hate crime, to understand from them the impact, to alert them to third-party reporting and the ways of contacting the police to report it. We always, as you know, put out extra patrols, reassurance patrols around particular religious festivals, because we know that that can attract the attention of undesirable groups. We have issued awareness training to all of our officers on anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crime in recent months as a result of the tensions in the Middle East. We have reinforced the need for our local intelligence teams to do scanning every day in relation to any local tensions and make sure that is briefed out to operational officers. All of our call handlers have been trained specifically in how to identify and support hate crime victims when they contact us, and this training will be extended in due course to dedicated ward officers and other colleagues on BCUs. A number of other issues, trying to pick out the more important one. We work very closely with the Community Safety Trust, the London Jewish Forum and Shomrim as a result of the tensions, particularly in those areas with high levels of Jewish citizens living in there. We work very closely with them in the run-up to the various pro-Palestinian demonstrations. And although we saw the very highly publicised and completely unacceptable behaviour by people in the vehicles, they were identified, not actually retrospectively, but on the day the four people were arrested as a result of that and are going through the criminal justice system. But we've also worked very closely to try to chase down people that we have on video who've committed offences during the various demonstrations, and working closely with the CPS and their special lawyers to identify the offences and the offenders. And we're using our resources to continue that work. Internally, we work closely with our various staff associations, staff support associations, Muslim officers, Jewish officers, Sikh and black officers around hate crime to focus on their welfare, because often some of these figures, some of these increases in hate crimes are actually reflective of the abuse that our officers and staff are getting at various demonstrations or on operational duties elsewhere. So we work very closely with them to support them. And as you will know, we have extended Operation Hampshire, which is the operation we have to support officers who were assaulted on duty. We've extended that to officers who are victims of racial or rather hate abuse on duty as well. So they come within that, and they get all the support of Operation Hampshire to take that through the criminal justice system to make sure that the offenders get the appropriate punishment. I'll probably leave it there, Chair.
Okay, well, thank you for the detailed answer, Deputy Commissioner. I was going to actually ask both of you questions about hate crime against our East and Southeast Asian communities and against Jewish Londoners, but I think you covered those two areas. But in terms of anti-Semitism, Deputy Commissioner, and I think I know what the answer is, but you've got high visibility patrols in certain areas. Are they having an impact? Clearly, they are reassuring, obviously.
Well, we believe they have, because I suppose I didn't finish my comment about that. We saw the high-profile, unacceptable, unlawful behaviour by some of the people involved in those demonstrations, which we tackled on the day. We're following others up. But what we didn't see, because it didn't happen, was that a number of the drive-outs from various parts of the UK coming down to London were actually intercepted by the Met, by roads policing officers in the main, and we made sure that those convoys of vehicles, which were not initially unlawful in themselves, did not go near any Jewish areas. And on the odd occasion when we didn't know about it, so when the demonstrators get in touch with us and tell us they're going to do a convoy from Birmingham or Bradford or somewhere into London, we agreed the route with them to keep them out of Jewish areas. And most of the organisers cooperated with us, and we're grateful for that. Where we had impromptu convoys of vehicles waving Palestinian flags and causing undoubted distress in Jewish communities, we responded very quickly and arrests were made. And there are at least 2 examples I know of where arrests were made very, very quickly of people who were breaking the law in relation to racial and religious abuse of Jewish communities. So I'm very confident that when we know about it, we stop it. And when we find out about it, because we weren't told by the organisers, we respond very effectively locally, because the local officers are very sensitive to the needs of different communities, not just the Jewish community, but lots of communities around London.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Again, that's very reassuring. So, Deputy Mayor, you'll be aware that recently the Assembly passed a motion proposed by Assembly Member Susan Hall, calling on the Mayor and the Met to publish a specific strategy to tackle anti-Semitism in London. Will you commit to developing this strategy?
Certainly in terms of tackling anti-Semitism, I mean, through the Police and Crime Plan, we will continue to have a focus on hate crime. We certainly will look at that in terms of what more needs to be done and what additionality there should be to make sure that we tackle anti-Semitism and all hate crime. Okay.
So I take it as you'll think about it. And
well, I think the question... I think the question is, there's absolutely no equivocation on the need to tackle anti-Semitism. Okay. My question is, what is the best way of ensuring that our capacity is focused on that delivery of tackling hate crime and anti-Semitism, and what's the best way of doing that?
I'll leave it at that. Perhaps Assembly Hall can explain the reasoning behind her motion, but it was, the Assembly passed it. There was an amendment, but it was about a specific strategy to tackle anti-Semitism in London. But look, moving on, Deputy Commissioner, we had a briefing from Commander Jane Connor on policing during the, in the lead up to the Euros and during the Euros. But I got to ask you this question for the benefit of Londoners out there. So we are now entering the quarter-final stages, and I understand that the Met have, quote, a great many specialist units to prevent crime and disorder, unquote, during the Euros, with a quote, particular focus, unquote, on, quote, tackling domestic abuse, violence against women and girls, and hate crime. Could you just sort of tell us a bit more about the work of these specialist units over the next over the last few days and the next 2 to 3 weeks?
Sure. So we've focused on areas where we know that there will be mixing of various fan groups in and around London, and the examples being Hyde Park, Leicester Square in central London, and obviously the fan zones in Trafalgar Square and near City Hall as well. And we put extra patrols into those areas. All of our officers are briefed pre the various matches, to remind them that if they are present and they see any discriminatory behaviour, they must take action. And I'll sort of go back to my comments earlier in the session, that officers are reminded of the need to be impartial in events, but to act when they see the law being broken. So they are expected to take positive action if they see hate crime or hear hate crime taking place. We work very closely with the Royal Parks, with UEFA and the Wembley Stadium to support and advise staff around them, so that they identify any worrying behaviour. in relation to hate crime, we can deal with that quickly. And we've worked with the GLA around the fan zone and established protocols and messaging about zero tolerance, which are flashed up on the screens. And we've also spoken with the football stewards so that they've been briefed and can act with us in partnership to try to deal with these events, either before they take place, if it looks like there's going to be trouble, or immediately afterwards to deal with it.
Thank you. So, Deputy Mayor, a couple of questions about this committee's 2019 report, an investigation into hate crime. Our 2019 report recommended that MOPAC conduct an in-depth analysis to find out whether the increase in recorded hate crime in recent years was due to an increase in confidence to report, or whether there was an actual increase in incidents taking place. Have you now conducted this work, and are you able to offer your thoughts on this?
We've not completely, no, we haven't yet done that work because of the workload and the timings of it, but it's certainly something we'll look at.
Okay, fine. If you could keep it on your agenda. And the other question, Deputy Mayor, as we know, those who commit hate crimes are more likely to go on to commit more serious crimes. So again, in response to our report in 2019, you said you'd be reviewing the work that was in place to deal with hate crime offenders in London. Can you say whether this has taken place? And are you now satisfied that there are adequate schemes in place to deal with and rehabilitate hate crime offenders?
So in relation to hate, I mean, it's part of the issue around detections and prosecutions, and that's certainly something that we've been looking at in terms of what's the best way of ensuring that those that it's part of the programmes of the Shared Endeavour Fund, that you're working with communities and working with offenders and working with victims to make sure that we can find the best ways. I don't have it in front of me in terms of where that has got to and what the evidence is on that. I'd have to get back to you.
Thank you. Turning to you, Deputy Commissioner, in March this year, Home Office Minister Baroness Williams said that the government would be asking police forces to record and identify any crimes motivated by hostility based on their sex on an experimental basis. The Mayor has said he supports the introduction of recording gender-based hate crime and gave his support for this within his election manifesto. The Commissioner, and I asked her this question in September 2016, said, and I quote, she was those exact words, she was extremely skeptical about the recording of gender-based hate crime. Presumably she has now changed her thinking, or has had to change her thinking in light of the Mayor's election manifesto. So are you supportive of trialling the introduction of gender-based hate crime recording in London?
So you're correct in your sort of summary of the Commissioner's position, and I don't believe that it has changed. I think it's important to point out that simply because something appears in the Mayor's manifesto doesn't mean that it will translate into operational policing matters. The Mayor sets strategy for us, but he doesn't decide operational matters. That's for the Commissioner to do. She's made her position pretty clear on this, I think, so far. We're awaiting further in guidance or instruction from the Home Office in relation to Baroness Williams's commentary, because we weren't aware that it was going to happen, and therefore we just need to understand exactly what the government has in mind. Our position on it, of course, is that we have a strong belief, and I have to say this is. I don't want this to appear to be this is just the Commissioner's view. So Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe, who is a national lead for policing on domestic abuse, is also needs to be convinced on this, and does not believe it's necessarily the right step. And with those two powerful women having those views, and they're very well informed, I think the Met is still waiting to understand what the proposals are before we respond in any way to those exact proposals.
I'm not really sure what to make of that answer, Deputy Commissioner. I mean, 7 police forces in England have now introduced policies to begin recording gender-based hate crime. Nottinghamshire piloted this scheme in 2016, and that's why I raised it at the Police Committee in September 2016, because I read an article in the Times about this. And then various questions to the Deputy Mayor. I was informed that the Met were evaluating the pilots. So that's been the case for the last 2 to 3 years. You're still evaluating these pilots over over a fairly long period of time. And I mean, from what I understand, the Home Office Minister was very clear in what she was asking forces to do. I'm not even sure whether this is an operational matter.
Well, I don't think that it was that clear, and that's why we're waiting for extra guidance. And yes, we understand that other forces have done it, but individual chief constables will make their own minds up about this, and the commissioner has a view on it, which I share, which is we don't believe that it will add that much to the ability for us to identify and bring to justice people who are haters of women. We think that the vast majority of examples that are quoted to us are already substantive offences on the statute book and could be dealt with without a further legislation being added into the statute book.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. I'll come back. Just one final question, Chair. I'm conscious of the time. So the charity Hope Not Hate, who are the leading campaigners in this field of monitoring hate crime, had this to say in their State of Hate in 2021 report, which came out, I think, in March this year, that COVID-19 has quickened the demise of many traditional far right-wing groups, whilst younger, tech-savvy hate merchants have thrived with more fluid online activities. So, Deputy Commissioner, how do you monitor these online merchants of hate?
So that I would agree, I think, with that estimate. In general, we have seen, and speaking to my colleague Neil Basu, who leads on counter-terrorism, we've seen a worrying trend where extremist views are being held by younger and younger people. And often, as you've identified and indicated, that translates, because they're more used to it, that translates to online activity, which then can translate into real world activity quite obviously. So we do monitor, obviously it's brought to our attention, and that's why we are working very hard through our strategic partnership to let people know that they can report this to us. We've translated hate crime literature into several languages so that wider communities understand what hate crime is and how to report it to us. And we've doubled victim referrals to hate crime charities in recent months because we want to make sure that people get support. So we monitor where we're aware of it, we will look at online. So I would urge anyone who's feels they're a victim or are being subjected to hate crime online to get in touch with us, and we will deal with that appropriately. But obviously we don't monitor all channels all the time. we don't have the legislation or the resources to do that. So much of this is up to the providers of platforms, if they identify it, to block it and to report it to us, or if people feel victimised by it, to report it to us, and we will deal with it.
Just a final comment, Chair. I mean, see, this is actually the problem. I think you sort of identified this, Deputy Commissioner. Many of these sites are actually based in America, and I think there are obviously legal issues, jurisdictional issues.
Yeah, I understand that, and it's a much more complex situation, isn't it, than somebody walking down the high street and abusing somebody in the real world. It makes it much more complex for us. But again, I go back to providers and the social responsibility of providers. Most of the providers of platforms are US based. I know the British government is keen, and I've heard the Home Secretary talk about it, keen to make the moral responsibility and the social responsibility more real for platform providers, and it's something that we would absolutely echo. We do work with them closely. So again, I know this from Neil Basu's world, that the providers are better at closing sites down quicker. But I think we need to think about moving that from the terrorism and the extremist world into probably more into hate crime issues as well, because the internet and social platforms shouldn't be a safe space in any shape or form for hate crime and for those sort of opinions.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Chair, I finished.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our question and answer session. I'd like to thank our guests for their attendance and their diligent answering of all of these very complex questions. Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion and the monthly reports received from MOPAC?
Noted.
You are free to go, Deputy Mayor. And so are you, Deputy Commissioner, you are free to go.
Thank you.
Can I also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with deputy chairman, party group lead members to agree any outputs arising from this meeting.
Yes.
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the work programme, and can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chairman, the party group lead members to agree a letter to the Home Affairs Select Committee in relation to their inquiry into violence against women and girls? The date of the next committee meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, the 7th of July 2021 at 10 p.m. here in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.